And this is the final session of our three-day workshop on political intellectual histories of 20th century South Asia. The idea behind this was, of course, to move beyond the great men histories that has dominated the intellectual history arena for a long time, and we wanted to move not just beyond the accessible great men, but also beyond the accessible sources into newer territories such as canonical sources, intellectual alterities, and of course the everyday political. Keep in line with that, our panel we would be concluding with the panel which is titled Interrogating the Everyday Political Through Caste, Class, and Gender. Chair for the panel is Professor Samita Sen. Shomita Sen received a PhD from Cambridge University in 1992 and was JRF at College 1990 to 1994. She taught at Calcutta University and Jadavpur University from 94 to 2018. In this period between 2013 and 2015, she served as first Vice Chancellor at Diamond Harbour Women's University. She was also Dean, Faculty of Interdisciplinary Studies, Jadavpur University between 2016 and 2018. Her monograph, Women and Labour in Late Colonial India, was published by Cambridge University Press in 1999, and it won the Trevor Rees Prize in Commonwealth History. She has published extensively on gender and labour. Her specialization is colonial South Asia, but she has also done contemporary and interdisciplinary research on issues such as domestic violence and labour in the informal sector. She is a member of editorial boards of various academic journals, including Modern Asian Studies and South Asian History and Culture. She has been active in the women's movement in India and internationally. She participated in both the governmental and non-governmental fora of the Beijing Conference in 1995. Our discussant is Dr. Kiran Keshavamurthy. Dr. Keshavamurthy is Assistant Professor of English at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Guwahati. Dr. Keshavamurthy was previously an Assistant Professor of Cultural Studies at the Center for Studies Calcutta. He is a scholar of modern Tamil literature, and he has written extensively on gender, sexuality, and caste in literature. His book entitled Beyond Desire, Sexuality in Modern Tamil Literature was published by OUP in 2016. It's over to you, Professor Sen.
Thank you very much, Rohit. Let me just start by saying, by apologizing that I've not been able to attend many sessions in this workshop because this is peak marking time for our undergrad exams. So I deeply regret that, but whatever little I have heard, I have enjoyed very much of this conference. And let me begin by congratulating Rohit for putting together an absolutely fantastic program running through to 3 days, despite the enormous challenges of our current situation in various parts of the world. So with those few words, let me begin the program. We have four speakers. We have 5 speakers actually and 4 papers. And we have a discussant. Each paper has been allotted 20 minutes. And in the interests of having a good discussion, I would encourage paper presenters to stick to the allotted time. And then we have a discussant, Dr. Keshavamurthy, who will speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and then it will be open for discussion, open to the floor. So shall we start with Sugata? Are you, yeah? So Sugata Nandi will speak on riots, masses and nations, violence and nationhood among subalterns of colonial Calcutta, 1946-47. He has studied history at Presidency College, Calcutta and Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His PhD was in 2015. He has been the recipient of several national and international fellowships, including those held at universities of Washington, University of Edinburgh, and London. He has worked earlier on the history of crime and criminality in colonial India. He's currently working on the history of Indian magic in the modern age, which is fascinating. I'd love to have heard a little bit about that. And he has also taught in at Presidency College, Calcutta, and is currently at the Department of History, West Bengal State University, also in Calcutta, India. He has presented many papers, 25 international conferences, given a number of public lectures. So we are fascinatedly looking forward to this. Sugata. Sugata, you have to unmute.
Sugata, yes. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Sugata, you have 20 minutes. I will just remind you closer to the time when it's over, when it's getting over.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you can hear me loud and clear?
Yes.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to speak on riots, masses and nations, violence and nationhood among subalterns of colonial Calcutta. The last 1 year of colonial rule in Calcutta was marred by frequent attacks of Hindu-Muslim riots of unprecedented magnitude and unheard of ferocity, which, in the opinion of many leading historians, led to the partition of India. The majority of those who took part in these conflagrations, known in history as partition riots, belonged to the working class of the city and were devoid of education and electoral rights, which made them marginal in society and politics. Their violent acts in the riots have been written off either as communal or criminal, turning them into the proverbial other of the nationalists. Challenging such judgments, this paper argues that the masses took to violence with the sole and express purpose of attaining nationhood. It asserts that they were informed by their perceptions of discrimination, injustice, subjection to the upper and middle classes, and heroic struggles against colonialism which shunned non-violence, which together constituted their idea of nationhood, which found expression in their riot violence. Following the stalemate in the cabinet mission, Muhammad Ali Jinnah on 29th July 1946 urged the Muslims of India to take to direct action on 16th August to attain Pakistan. On that day, a riot of unforeseen proportions broke out in Calcutta, the provincial capital of Bengal, where the Muslim League was in power with Hussain Shahid Sarawardi as its premier. He had declared 16th of August a holiday. The Muslim League called a general strike and a mammoth meeting at the Calcutta Maidan, a sprawling park in the heart of the city, in support of the demand for Pakistan on the day. Clashes among Hindus and Muslims are from early morning on that day, as Muslim League activists tried to enforce a strike on unwilling Hindu shopkeepers, and as crowds of Hindus fought pitched battles, with Muslims on their way to join the meeting in support of Pakistan. By evening, the riot had spread all over the city, and the number of slums in north and central Calcutta had been reduced to ashes. Trucks ferried League activists armed with uniformly made staves and other improvised weaponry, inflammable material, and in a few cases, firearms. By afternoon the next day, innumerable lives had been lost due to the riot, and dead bodies lay strewn on the main streets of the city. As the troops were out late in the afternoon that day, the rioting crowds dispersed, but looting of shops, warehouses, and households continued unabated. On 18th August, the mixed localities had turned into no-go areas for either the Hindus or the Muslims, and thousands of people evicted from their homes started seeking shelter in police stations, a number of which in turn became targets of rioters. Complicity of upper and middle classes in the riot became evident at this point when the police recovered a large number of swords, explosives, and a few firearms from private vehicles and residential buildings. On 19th August, fatal localized clashes spread across the city as troops patrolled the main streets. On the next day, large number of back alley ambush and killings, along with raids and looting by crowds, kept post-hostilities alive. And police stations found it difficult to shelter an ever-growing number of riot victims. On 21st August, when the riot had spent its fury, innumerable dead bodies and debris lay scattered over the main roads, posing a threat of an epidemic. Joint pickets of the police and the army stood at every 100 yards or so, Most localities had turned into ghettos of Hindus or Muslims. Venturing out on the streets often meant risking fatal attacks by unknown assailants, and bare necessities, including food, had become scarce. The scale of death and destruction caused by the riot was so overwhelmingly high that the statesman, the leading daily of the city, termed it the Great Calcutta Killing. Calcutta remained in a state of tense calm from then on till the end of the year. The military remained stationed in the city to prevent outbreaks of riots up to December and enforced dusk to dawn curfew daily. The Bengal governor proclaimed a state of emergency under the Presidency Area Emergency Security Act of 1926, empowering the police to arrest anyone suspected of rioting. The police arrested over 1,000 persons within a fortnight. In January 1947, a communal rapprochement seemed possible, and life in the city appeared to return to the ways of times before the riot. Such hopes were belied as localized rioting recurred in the city from on 25th March onwards, which intensified and claimed 17 lives 2 days later. Riots continued through the first fortnight of April, and by the end of the month, the Calcutta police noted that there were 700 minor clashes, which claimed 80 lives. Rioters of this phase had taken to hurling acids and improvised explosives to kill and maim. The Bengal governor observed that by then, the outbreaks of violence had turned into, I quote, a stream now ebbing, now flowing, never ceasing for more than a few days. Riots of this phase, unlike that of August 1946, didn't amount to combats to bring about partition or to prevent it. As Joy Chatterjee has shown that in 1947, Bengali Hindus expressed their support for partition of the province as strongly as the Muslims, though for different reasons. A unique feature of riots of this phase was the forceful eviction of people of one community by violent attackers of the other from many localities, who then brought their co-religionists to settle in the houses they had forcibly vacated. Till early June, the Hindu politicians alleged that people of their faith bore the brunt of such evictions. After Mountbatten's declaration of 3rd June 1947, which made partition imminent, followed by the formation of the Congress government for the future Indian state of West Bengal under P.C. Ghosh in July, the Hindus of the city went on an offensive against Muslims with renewed vigor. They started killing Muslim policemen, then turned on the common folk of the community, and soon high politicians of the Muslim League feared for their lives. Riots intensified from July 9th and continued through the rest of the month, and on 31st July, at least 18 people lost their lives at the hands of rioters. In early August, numerous arrests, random searches of commuters by the military, and daily imposition of curfew failed to prevent riots from intensifying. In such a situation, Gandhi sojourned in Calcutta from 9th August to 4th September and undertook fasts twice to bring peace to the city. He brought riots to an end on the eve of the Independence Day, when surprising scenes of fraternization among Hindus and Muslims replaced acts of violence. This proved short-lived as clashes recurred, on 31st August, when a crowd of Hindus went on a rampage in the Hyderabad mansion where Gandhi resided, vowing revenge on Saravati, who was with him there at the time. Gandhi undertook a fast on 2nd September to stop rioting and broke it a couple of days later when the Hindu and Muslim politicians promised to bring violence to an end. In his seminal study of communal riots in 20th century Bengal, Suranjan Das says that rioting crowds of Muslims in the Great Calcutta Killing comprised of coolies, factory workers, rickshaw pullers, hackney carriage drivers, masons, petty shopkeepers, dock workers, and butchers. Their Hindu combatants were represented by potters, milkmen, scavengers, crematorium workers, lowly shopkeepers, goldsmiths, scrap metal artisans, the dosats, a low Hindu subcaste, who were joined by a few better of Bengali merchants, students, and middle-class youths. Devjani Sengupta, in her brief study of the riot and its impact on the city, mentions the same occupational groups, which confirms the preponderance of the working class. From the records of the riots of 1947, it becomes evident that the same groups kept hostilities alive till independence and partition, and they were joined by a few upper and middle class compatriots, especially onwards from the month of June. As documents on the riot were produced by colonial officials, both European and Indian elites and middle class professionals, the voice of the working class hasn't been recorded in them, barring a few exceptions. This has resulted in the subaltern actors of the riot cast either as misled elemental masses or as criminals who took to rioting to rob from their social superiors, and also as marginal elements who sought to overcome their alienation, albeit temporarily, taking to communal violence. One man who fits such description and enjoyed eminence in Calcutta during and immediately after the Great Calcutta killing was Gopal Chandra Mukherjee. He was in the prime of his youth in 1946. Hailing from a poor Hindu Bengali family and barely educated, he was virtually unknown before the 16th of August. During the riot, he acted as a savior of his co-religionists, especially those from his neighborhood. From that time till the attainment of independence, he led a gang of armed youths, enjoyed patronage of high-ranking Bengali politicians, and acted as a self-appointed protector of Hindus of North and Central Calcutta, and temporarily won their unquestioning allegiance irrespective of class or caste. While he doesn't figure in the academic studies of the riot, but many eyewitnesses of the Great Calcutta killing remember him as a man they couldn't do without during the one fateful year which ended at the time of independence, period which ended at the time of independence. Gopal ran protection rackets over several Calcutta neighborhoods in the months following the riot. After independence, he was known for his proximity to the then Chief Minister of West Bengal, Bidhan Chandra Rai. When interviewed in his ancestral home in Malanga Lane in Calcutta in March 1999, he, then an octogenarian, took immense pride in what he recounted to be his heroic defense of quote-unquote the nation during 1946-47. He said that he had learned that the Muslim League would carry out an onslaught on the Hindus of Calcutta on the 16th of August from Hindu constables of the Calcutta police, whom he trained in wrestling. So he acquired a Mauser gun illegally, along with several rounds of ammunition and a number of swords. He raised a gang of Hindu youths for armed combat and named it the Bharatiya Jatiyo Bahini in Bengali, or the Indian National Army, after that of Subhash Chandra Bose. He said that he was supported in this by a few influential and wealthy Hindus whom he refused to name. He admitted to have killed Muslims in the riot and in its immediate aftermath. He wielded influence over large parts of central Calcutta and ran a business in stolen military vehicles with impunity, enjoying the patronage of Kiran Shankar Rai, the leader of Congress Legislative Party. After independence, his gang dispersed and many of his followers took to crimes like robbery. Tapan Rai Chaudhuri, the Oxford historian who witnessed the riot as a university student in Calcutta, remembers Gopal in his autobiography as a criminal whose rise to social eminence was a consequence of the all-pervasive fear created by the riot and an ineffectual city police. He laments that bright young men from respectable families were forced to pay obeisance to Gopal to save their lives as the city plunged into a spiral of communal violence, which Gopal and his ilk took advantage of to gain wealth and influence. Gopal, however, in his interview, described himself as someone who risked his life for his countrymen. His violence and killings were acts by which he believed to have forged his nationhood. His christening of his gang after Subhas Bose's INA was due to the fact that he took the riot as an occasion when the fight to secure the Indian nation was being reenacted, albeit against a different enemy and on a different terrain. Tested against this motive, the records of actions of nameless working class rioters, regardless of their religion, seem to affirm that violence was instrumental in the subalterns' vision of attaining nationhood in Calcutta during 1946-47. Their apparently mindless and unprovoked acts of ferocity reveal a discernible pattern on close scrutiny. Their actions, which appeared as criminality in the eyes of contemporary respectable observers and has been characterized by historians as communal, was to them a fight to become a nation. A few typical instances of the violence of the Great Calcutta killing and from the riots of 1947 will help to illustrate the point. Two students of the Calcutta University who resided in one of the worst affected localities of central Calcutta, who identified themselves as one B. Shen and A. Chakravarti. Evidently, Bengali Hindus of upper caste said that days before the riot, they saw several Muslims from the surrounding slums gather weapons. They collected staffs, torches, and sharpened objects into swords and spears. Then, on the morning of 16th August, having killed two Hindus, they laid siege to the university hostel where these two people lived. And the majority of students there were Hindus. The hostelers were fortunate to narrowly escape violent death as the police arrived on the spot on the next day and managed to rescue them from the hands of the crowds of Muslims. This instance of lived experience of the riot shows that poor Muslims had seen in their highly educated social superiors enemies of their nationhood. By murdering Hindus they could find in front of the hostel, the Muslim slum dwellers gave a display of their retributive powers, which they wanted to use against those who were privileged and were meant to be looked up to with deference during ordinary times. Charu Chandra Banerjee, a Bengali Hindu physician of the Calcutta Medical College, who claimed to have narrowly survived the murderous attack on 16th August, narrated a somewhat similar experience. He said that after returning from work on early morning from the hospital early morning on that day, he saw a huge crowd bearing a Muslim League flag and shouting Pakistan slogans in front of his house. They started battering doors of the Hindu houses in his neighborhood, and they were about to break open into his house. They were the wooden doors were giving away. At that point, they started pelting bricks from the top of from the terrace of his house. And by this time, a part of the crowd had broken into the offices in the neighborhood, which belonged to Hindus, and which diverted the attention of the crowd. Otherwise, he says, he won't have been alive to narrate this experience. His experience also shows that the riot was an event in which the animosity of subalterns towards upper and middle classes found violent expression and validation in the name of quest for a separate homeland. Okay. A similar case of attack narrated by another upper caste and upper class Bengali comes from one BC Babu, a resident of Park Circus, a predominantly Muslim locality, where he said he nearly died at the hands of his Muslim neighbors. His propertied Muslim neighbors who refrained from taking to violence failed to restrain poor co-religionists from mounting this attack. And the attackers burnt down his car, his library, looted jewelry from his house, then dragged everyone out of the streets, killed his Oriya Hindu cook, and mercilessly beat up his nephew, who was a student of the Calcutta Medical College. A last-minute intervention by a wealthy Muslim neighbor saved his and his family's lives. After this, he moved with his family to a shelter set up for riot victims. Similar cases have been narrated by Muslims of Calcutta. For example, one S.M. Hussain of
Dr. Nandi,
yes,
I think I'm not sure if it's your mic, but there seems to be a lot of wind or some sound. So
it's not my mic. It's
okay. Then I just request everybody else to just mute their own mics. Yeah, all of you, please mute your mics. Thank you.
Okay. Should I carry on?
Yes, please go ahead. Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Thank you. For example, one S.M. Hussain of central Calcutta said that the Hindus on the 16th August took it as a deciding day, and they started making unprovoked attacks on processionists, Muslim League processionists who were on their way to the Maidan to join the meeting for Pakistan. H.A. Hakam, a propertied Muslim from the southern neighborhood of the city, Bhawanipur, he said that he saw Hindus attack peaceful Muslim League processionists on the 16th of August, and in Bhawanipur, as they were in the majority, they set fire to a number of houses of Muslims, killing women and children who were locked up inside. In the following year, as riots broke out in Calcutta, again in March 1947, at many places, Muslims forcibly evicted Hindus to fill their vacant houses with their co-religionists. Several neighborhoods were turning into Muslim ghettos in this way. About this, Suresh Chandra Banerjee, a Congress legislator, said in the Bengal Assembly, "I have been elected from the area where riots are taking place nowadays. Every day I visit those places and I know that about the things that about the situation over there. I feel that such activities are a part of a well thought out plan. For the Muslim League wants to transform Bengal into a land exclusively for the Muslims, where even a single Hindu won't survive." He claimed that the pattern of communal attacks onwards from August 1946 revealed this sinister aim, that of turning Calcutta into a city of Muslims. He observed that from after March 1947, League activists had evicted a large number of Hindu residents from their homes in a number of neighborhoods in the city, and then resettled those areas with their co-religionists. Kosipur in the north, Ultabanga and Beliaghata in the east, Entally in central Calcutta were such places. Sanat Ray Chaudhary, a leader of the Hindu Mahasabha, said that Park Circus, till before the riots of March 1947, was a mixed neighborhood. It turned into a no-go area as the Muslim League carried out a pogrom, driving out all the Hindus from there. The Hindus started retaliating against this after 3rd June, as they knew that the Muslim League was all set to lose power in the province. They started killing Muslim policemen, and the incidence of such attacks increased from the end of June, when the complicity of the Hindus of upper class with lower class rioters became evident due to the use of firearms. For example, on 20th June, unknown assailants shot to death two Muslim policemen of the city while they were on duty. On 23rd June, three Muslim policemen were shot to death. A couple of days later, another Muslim policeman died of gunshots while guarding a picket during a curfew. These cases created such a panic that 250 Muslim policemen refused to join duty on the next day. In July, as P.C. Ghosh's cabinet for the future Indian state of West Bengal came into office, sporadic attacks on Muslims at large started taking place all over the city, which proved that having killed and intimidated policemen of the community, the Hindu rioters wanted to forcibly claim Calcutta as the site of their nationhood. Sarawardi and other important leaders of the League accused the Congress of victimizing Muslims by letting loose Hindu criminals. They alleged that the Calcutta police had been influenced by Hindu ministers of the Congress party to allow the victimization of Muslims. Muhammad Usman, the former Muslim League mayor of Calcutta, claimed that armed Hindu gangs were at work in the city to kill and maim Muslims at large, and asked for police protection for himself while venturing out. He said, and I quote, "The outbreak of communal disturbances has been engineered mainly with the objective of terrorizing Muslims, and thus forcing them by means of violence to give up their claims to Calcutta." Now, I'd like to conclude. In the 1 year leading to independence and partition on 15th August 1947, large sections of the subalterns of Calcutta took to violence after being called upon by the elites to determine their political destiny. From August 1946, great many of them chose violence as a means to forge nationhood. As religious community and nation became synonymous, they mounted, and as religious community and nation became synonymous, they mounted unprovoked murderous attacks on people of their respective opposite community. They interpreted their attacks as the most effective means to defeat and decimate those they perceived to stand in the way of actualization of their nationhood, which in many cases were Indians of upper and middle class who, by virtue of their wealth and wisdom, were superior to wealth and education, were superior to them in social status. This meant that their forging of nationhood was an act of transgression which subverted the rigid social hierarchies. Those among the working class rioters who've been remembered as criminals due to their use of violence thought of themselves as heroic saviors who killed only to protect their respective nations. In 1947, when partition of the country won the support of the majority of both Hindus and Muslims of Bengal, the violent rivalry for attaining nationhood among the two communities, or among the subalterns of the two communities, turned into a battle for making Calcutta a microcosm of their territorial nations. These translated into clashes to claim the city for either of the two communities. Muslims sought to accomplish the objective by forcibly occupying neighborhood after neighborhood with their co-religionists after evicting evicting the Hindu residents. The latter attempted to fulfill the same by killing Muslim policemen, then attacking Muslims of all classes, striking terror among them, and especially so in the hearts of elite politicians, so as to force them to leave the city and to turn it into a locus of their belligerent nationhood. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nandi. Wonderful presentation. Really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you so much.
You've posed a number of range of questions about working class vis-a-vis community and nation. And indeed, I will ask you when questions open, how you would see the relationship between subalternity, which you have repeatedly invoked, with working class identities, which also you have. Is there a tension? What would be the theoretical resolution of these two categories? But in the meanwhile, we will hear a paper jointly from Mohimarnab Biswas and SVD Chandrasekhar. Mohimarnab Biswas is a junior research fellow pursuing a PhD in cinema studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics at JNU, New Delhi. His work primarily deals with the politics of popular culture, with special focus on Bombay cinema. He is specifically interested in the linkages of cinema, law, criminality, vigilantism, and social justice. His postgraduate dissertation was called His Name is Khan, Exploring Identity and Image Through Shah Rukh Khan. He has also made a couple of documentary films titled Ashiana and the Dhamma Chakra Turns. His work has featured in popular platforms like Roundtable India, and he has a chapter forthcoming publication in a book, Bahujan Legend, Brahminical Telling, Decoding the Lens of Tanhaji, the Unsung Warrior. His co-presenter is SVD Chandrasekhar, who is a junior research fellow pursuing an MPhil in Women's Studies at Jadavpur University. Their work explores the intersections of queer and trans feminism, sexuality and development, anti-caste discourse, and political economy, which is a very interesting mix of things, I have to say. And his dissertation is an autoethnography of queer collectivization. It outlines, or will try and outline, an Ambedkarite vision of transgender justice. They are also a published poet writing about the life worlds of identities. Their poems have featured in a number of anthologies. The paper they are presenting is titled Recasting the Caste Question, an Enquiry into the Bhadralok Domination During Left Rule in 20th Century West Bengal. I'm sure we are all eagerly waiting to hear this presentation. They will both present the paper. Can I hand over to you, Mohimarnab?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Sen. Hello, everybody. Due to the paucity of time, I'll quickly jump on. Our paper primarily, am I audible, by the way?
Yeah. Yes, you are.
Our paper primarily attempts to read into the Bhadralok domination during the left regime in 20th century West Bengal. Using Stephen Lukes' typology of power, we studied this domination through the registers of primarily representation, the left's engagement with the refugee question in post-partition West Bengal, its education policies, the response of the regime to Dalit assertion, the myth of castelessness in Bengal with Kolkata as the center, and the party society configuration. Uh, it's an interesting moment in West Bengal after the 2021 elections, where for the first time since independence, the left has been reduced to zilch. So we take this opportunity to kind of take a retrospective dive into the annals of history of 20th century Bengal to understand the Bhadralok domination of the left regime. Uh, and yeah, so I mean, Chand will take us through the brief sort of historical landscape we have kind of covered for this discussion. And following that, Chand will take us to the methodological framework which we have used for this paper. And following that, we will dive into the Lucian sort of framework where we are talking about the three phases of power. Over to you, Chand.
Thank you, Meek. The history of the supposed castelessness of Bengal and the Bhadralok domination in the left regime might give an impression that this is how it has always been in Bengal polity and society. However, a study of the caste dynamics in the colonial period reveals that this is far from reality. Bengal has had a rich history of Dalit assertion such that it even threatened the Bhadralok stranglehold over politics, especially by the Namashudras and the Rajbonshis. For the sake of conceptual clarity, we have gone by Sarvani Bandyopadhyay's definition of Bhadralok as a status category consisting of upper, higher caste men who pursued a modern education, were engaged in the secular professions, had links with land in the form of rentier interest, and were disdainful of manual labor, imbued with caste capital. While this was by no means completely close to those located lower down in the caste hierarchy, it was overwhelmingly dominated by the upper castes. Taking cognizance of the complicated category of the Bhadraloks, throughout the paper, we have used the term to denote only the upper caste members of the category. Nirmal Kumar Bose talks about how this period brought about social mobility, the colonial period. And however, the diffusion of opportunities was not uniformly spread across castes and was limited to the three higher castes of Bengal, the Brahmin, Kayast, and Vaidyas. Then we come to the interesting relationship that was there between the Communist Party of India and the federation that was existing at that time. And we see that even though their demands were same with respect to the Tebhaga movement, and the demands had already been raised by Jogendranath Mandal earlier, there was not a convergence of interests and movement between the two. And we see this because of the Bhadralok leadership of the CPI, which precluded it from seeing the class critique of the Congress and the national movement by the Dalits. They demanded that Dalit politics must eschew its radical and separatist character and focus on India's independence and Dalit upliftment. Shekhar Bandyopadhyay talks about the nationalist resolution of the caste question in Bengal, and but this is disputed by Doipayan Sen, who says that this was only possible with a systemic undermining, both subtle and overt, of Jogendranath Mandal's attempt to form an independent political existence of the Dalits by the Bhadralok across party lines. This resolution was accomplished only by extinguishing the flames of Dalit socio-political assertion in the face of structural oppression by the caste hierarchy. When we look at our methodology, so we have used social discourse analysis, where we have used autobiographical accounts, party resolutions, Instagram posts, etc., to understand the interplay of hegemony, power relations, and social conditions. Under the rubric of living history, we have also sought to document voices from the margins through oral histories and material from grey literature. Inviting Meg.
Thanks. Luke's kind of conceptualizes power as having three phases: decision-making power, non-decision-making power, and ideological power. So we have kind of deployed Luke's three-dimensional lens of understanding power to explore how the Bhadralok dominated left cemented its hegemony and perpetuated the discourse of casteism in Bengal, or were at least privy to that discourse of casteism. It's important to flag here that the functioning of the Bhadralok has also happened beyond the regulatory parameters of the electoral left, which is to imply that the Bhadralok has had an autonomous mode of functioning in perpetuating the myth of casteism, which should not be attributed solely to the left regime. We have also tried to kind of respond to Ayan Guho's recent contention that there was no deliberate upper caste conspiracy to silence the articulation of Dalit interest in Bengal, and that the upper caste hegemony was an unintended consequence of the left's electoral and political strategy to broaden their support base. We dispute this contention on multiple grounds. First, the reading of the Bhadralok domination in the left regime through the lens of conspiracy is extremely reductionist to us and overlooks the fundamental ways that caste societies function, and also the question of Dalit agency being completely sort of elided in this aspect. Second, the deployment of the three-dimensional view of power of the Luxian framework throws light on what constitutes the political and maps the coordinates of Bhadralok domination that facilitated their unchecked sort of hegemony in Bengal in the 20th century. The first phase of power, which is the prism of decision making, when Luke talks about the observable conflict of subjective interests seen as policy preferences revealed by political participation, we'll mainly talk about two aspects. One, the question of representation within the hierarchy of the left parties, and also the refugee question and the left's contentious relationship to the refugee question. As far as the question of representation is concerned, I would like to probably start with a very funny anecdote. In an interview with Mukul Kesavan in 2013, Sitaram Yechuri had narrated an incident where Kanchiram had asked him about the absence of Dalits in the West Bengal government. And apparently Yechuri was shocked to hear this. So he said that, okay, I'm going to go and find out what's the deal. And then shockingly, he discovered many Dalits and tribals. Yechuri said that he was, or the party was beyond these things. And his lack of consciousness of caste is reflective of the carefully orchestrated image of the left of being progressive and therefore beyond sort of caste considerations. It's important to note that since inception, the CPIM has not incorporated a single Dalit or Adivasi member in the Politburo, which is the nerve center of the party. Similarly, the higher rungs of the party and the West Bengal government have always been dominated by the trio of the Brahmins, Kayas, and Boitos. It's important to see what Monoranjan Bapari, the famous anti-caste author and incumbent MLA of the Trinamool Congress, said to us in his quote, in his telephonic interview. He basically said that the left, sort of wanted that the people should only follow them and accept their leadership irrefutably, which is precisely why they avoided the caste question throughout their sort of rule in West Bengal. Pointing such a skewed representation in the major centers of power is important for us and is a sort of useful prelude to discussing a few major moments in the history of the left regime as regards the question of reservation as well. So the implementation of the Mandal Commission's recommendation of other backward classes reservation, although was a kind of radical step and a major step towards providing affirmative action to the OBCs, the left sort of remained unwilling to accept the existence of OBCs in the state, as well as to execute a reservation on the basis of caste. A committee set up by the West Bengal government to inquire into the question of caste backwardness in August 1980 maintained that poverty and low levels of living standards, rather than caste, should, in our opinion, be the most important criteria for identify backwardness. And this is something which is reflected in Jyoti Basu's reply to the Mandal Commission, where he said that viewing the society through the lens of caste is not relevant anymore because West Bengal has apparently become communist and caste is a legacy of the feudal order. So there were only two castes in West Bengal, which is the rich and the poor. So not only did the left regime consistently fail to act in the positive direction on the issue of reservation and representation, the left-dominated syndicates, case in point being the Calcutta University Syndicate, effectively created obstacles in the process of the smooth implementation of reservation policies. We also have looked at Kanti Biswas, who was the education minister of the left government, his autobiography, which is Amar Jibon Kichu Kotha, My Life, Few Words, to understand the erasure of the caste question within the party sort of structure, where Kanti Biswas laments that he was not heard in the CPIM West Bengal state committee meetings when he spoke about the fact that the left-wing government had lost a case of 1976 law of positive discrimination in the Kolkata High Court for violating the law of affirmative action while appointing many primary school teachers. So hopping on to the left and the refugee question, it's important to point out here that it's a very complicated question, and we have kind of tried to deal with it in terms of multiple registers. And the first register being that this should be seen in light of the Congress regime, which kind of actively rehabilitated upper caste refugees across the board. Chand, can we move to that slide where Monoranjan Bapari is talking about? Yeah. So Monoranjan Bapari says that the Congress regime built colonies selectively for the upper caste refugees, It was difficult to find out lower caste refugees in the colonies that immediately sprang up after partition. The left, however, accommodated people from all castes primarily due to electoral considerations. But what did happen was that the plots were assigned to people largely based on their caste. So the officials would ask the names. Some Mondol would be given some plot in the interiors, but some Acharjo would be given a lucrative plot beside the main road. So it's important to note that the refugee question is one which requires us to kind of investigate a lot of registers. But our attempt here has been to question the monolithic identity rendered to the social category of refugees in major partition discourses. And also how the creation of this discourse kind of led to the creation of the myth of castelessness in Kolkata, with looking at Bhadralok complicity in that sense. The leveling out of the deeply divided history and politics of refugee resettlement by furthering a sense of singular identity of the refugee can partly be attributed to the left regime's propaganda to glorify and to a certain extent exoticize the struggles of the self-settled refugee. And also the subsumption of the deeply fractured refugee identity in the broader concerns of the left regime's class mobilization has resulted in the erasure of differential experience of the refugees owing to their caste locations to the dominant discourses. So the major leitmotif has been across the major partition experiences has been the nostalgic ruminations of the lost homeland of the romantic Bhadralok in a certain sense. It needs to be flagged here that the left was a primary player in kind of opposing the Congress government's decision to rehabilitate the refugees in Dandakaranya. But after the communists came to power, they took a massive historical U-turn and they carried out the biggest genocide, one of the biggest genocides of 20th century, which is the Mori Japi massacre. Yeah, so I would just like to end this section with this quote. We spoke to Joydeep Dotto, who is a doctoral scholar at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and his doctoral work is on the camp and the refugee identity. And he said the following, and I quote, "It's important for us to understand the left's interpretation of the refugee question. The left, in some sense, merged the farmer and the refugee identities in favor of the class question. It tried to use the interpretation of class politics while dealing with the refugee issue. The colony refugees could be interpreted through the lens of class, but the left could not define the large part of the refugees of the camps who were shifted out of Bengal. But they did not understand how to categorize them. The refugee is in itself a distinct existence. To add to the complications, there was bad blood due to the communal bad blood amongst the Namoshudros and the Muslims due to the riots in East Bengal, East Pakistan. The left was a little scared and skeptical to address the refugee question, but later on, through Operation Borga and Jabardakhl movements, which is the forceful acquisition of land movements, they got attached to this question. Joydeep Dotto kind of interestingly says, this is a philosophical poverty of the left. Since Marx wrote only on the Jewish question, which is to do more with emancipation, the left was confused about what to do. They did not have a text to follow. They have always looked at the refugee question in the form of a category, which is why they have this metaphysical hallucination. They wanted to do dialectics, but ended up being hallucinated. Over to Chand for the next part of the discussion.
The second part is we're talking about the second phase of power, which explores non-decision making power that is not as overt as decision making. A non-decision essentially refers to a decision which suppresses any latent or manifest challenge that can thwart the values and interests of the decision maker. Demands for change can be smothered before it reaches the political arena, the decision-making arena. We study how the Bhadralok-dominated left leadership exercised this non-decision-making power and thereby defined what constitutes political and what does not, especially in the matter of caste, through an investigation into education and the left reaction to Dalit assertions. When we're talking about education and also left reaction to Dalit assertion, and the key incident is Chunni Kotal's suicide, which happened on 16th August 1992, ending years of systemic casteist abuse and injustice. The institutional forces driving Chunni Kotal to suicide merit study and discussion as they throw light on the toxic Brahminical ecosystem within which education is imbricated. Amiya Kumar Bagchi has conducted a detailed evaluation of the education policies of West Bengal and tellingly notes that in West Bengal, the issue of social exclusion as the issue of class has gone off the radar. He also compares the state of West Bengal to the state of Tripura, which gained communist, where the Communist Party of India, M, came into power in the 1980s, and he contrasts the two and says that In Tripura, the state of literacy among the marginalized sections, especially among the Adivasis, has gone much ahead as compared to Bengal. And he attributes this to the Adivasi leadership of the Communist Party there. We also see how, as Meg has pointed out earlier, and in Ritaranjan Das's essay on the study of education system in Bengal, how state higher education institutions provided another significant point of control. The party education cell was entrusted with the responsibility of choosing candidates for high-ranking positions, including VCs. Then we come to understanding the left reaction to Dalit assertion. This quote by Manohar Moli Biswas is very telling about how the BDSS was formed after Chunni Kotal's suicide and what was the reaction to it by left groups. Thus, we see how non-decision making operates through the Bhadralok left rule in two ways. First, the complete dominance by the Bhadralok left with respect to the education sector has two effects. It preserves their material privilege at the cost of the socio-economic mobility of Dalits and Adivasis. Moreover, it ensures their continuing ideological dominance because the lack of any noteworthy challenge to it is nipped in the bud before it can reach such a level. Second, the attempt to suppress Dalit assertion with respect to BDSS points to how Bhadralok left attempted to sanitize the public sphere and preclude any challenge to their dominance before it gains discursive power. Make on to you. Over to you.
Yeah, we'll quickly discuss the third phase of power, which is the ideological power. And here we have discussed about the myth of castelessness. So the Bhadralok refugee occupation of Kolkata had begun during the Congress regime, as discussed earlier. Although the left did manage to rehabilitate lower caste refugees, the domination of the overwhelming Bhadralok refugee population of Kolkata, which continued well into the left regime and continues till date, is too stark to miss. The narratives of upper caste refugees indulging in forceful acquisition of land to establish refugee colonies, Bijoygad being a key example, allotting land only to fellow Bhadralok refugees by displacing lower caste refugees and fearing to enter government camps populated by the Namashudros, are critical to understanding the genesis of overwhelming Bhadralok refugee occupation of Kolkata. Here we are kind of attempting to understand the making of the Bhadralok majority island of Kolkata, primarily to contest the myth of castelessness, the groundwork of which was discussed earlier in terms of the refugee question. Thus, we scrutinize the reorganization of Kolkata post-partition, the Bhadralok refugee occupation of spaces in the city, and the interlinkages of such occupation with the framing of Kolkata as the locus of the discourse of castelessness in Bengal. Professor Kalyan Kumar Das was kind enough to give us an interview, and he said, talking about the overwhelming majority of upper caste refugees in the southern parts of Kolkata, he said, I've been living in South Kolkata for more than a decade now, as a tenant of upper caste people from Eastern Bengal. That is the category of people I see all around my existence in South Kolkata. If you go to parts of Golf Green, Lake Gardens, Ajaynagar, Jadavpur, Gorfa, you will come across an overwhelming number of upper caste refugees from Eastern Bengal who have settled down and are doing quite well, actually. I have some Brahmin ex-refugee friends from these areas, and many of them have a very lazy life. They rent out their places. My own landlord has been unemployed for the last 20 years, yet he earns a lot of money to sustain himself in a posh area like Lake Gardens. The overwhelming majority, unquote, the overwhelming majority of Bhadraloks in general in Kolkata is a testament to the centrality of caste in the spatial organization of a city. We've seen how Dilip Singh Mondal wrote about it, that the lack of a single Dalit in 60% of Kolkata's neighborhoods corroborates the functioning of caste as an important marker of segregation in cities. Kolkata being a Bhadralok majority area has significant ramifications. The discourse of castelessness gaining currency is a significant one among them. The romantic idea of Kolkata being a progressive and beautiful city, perpetuated by the Bhadraloks to advance the myth of castelessness, is premised on what Professor Shubhajit Noshkar calls Bhadralok politeness, to denote the overarching impact of the discourse of civility in progressive spaces in Kolkata, thereby camouflaging caste discrimination and giving rise to near forms of caste civility. Noshkar's discussion of civility needs to be understood in the broader context of Hindu Bhadralok domination in the urban civil society. Such a romantic conceptualization of the city is, however, punctured by strong accounts of anti-caste voices. Case in point being Manoranjan Vyapari's relationship to the city of Kolkata, where he says, and this is a translation, "This is the city which from boyhood to youth gave nothing but hunger, humiliation, and torture. On several occasions it tried to kill me. Closing my eyes, I can still see amidst dark recesses of time the assassin's face waiting for me with open dagger. This city is my enemy. There is no question of loving it." Buffalo Intellectual, a popular anti-caste voice on the social media platforms, explains the problems with romanticizing Kolkata in an Instagram post, which he characterizes as a personal rant. He problematizes the notion of Kolkata being beautiful and charts out the distinction between affluent upper caste areas like Park Street, Alipur, Southern Avenue, etc., and areas like Topshia and Tangra, where he grew up in the 1990s. He calls out that the upper caste Bengalis consider these areas as the dens of lawlessness and filth. He goes on to describe his experience in these parts of the city, which were populated with endless slums inhabited by vulnerable, desperate Dalit and Pasmanda migrants hailing from interior Bengal, Bihar, East UP, living in conditions unfit for human settlement. The Bhadralok echo chamber of Kolkata is sort of resistant towards the caste question. Bhadraloks living their life within the confines of the city are uncomfortable with any counters to the status quo. Lower caste assertion or calling out of the caste privilege of upper caste Bhadraloks is scorned, and the caste question is rendered systemically insignificant. Professor Kollan Kumar Das said, had this to offer to us. You go and meet the professors in the social science departments at Presidency at Jadavpur University. If you raise the caste question, with the exception of a few, most would say that it is a dirty question. The romantic Bhadralok conceptualization of the lack of existence of caste is furthered by understanding caste only through the lens of violent atrocities committed against Dalits and Adivasis. Yes, if we are to understand caste only through that lens, probably not as many Dalits and Adivasis are killed in Bengal as in some other states. But if you look at the deep-rooted nature of the institution of caste and its myriad manifestations, it is very much present amongst us in all walks of life. Therefore, this myth of castelessness in Bengal kind of operates at the crossroads of spatial politics, urban segregation, and the erasure of gentrified spaces from dominant, sanitized discourses. Chand will take over the party society configuration.
So, summing up basically the party society configuration, we see how Bengali society and polity is characterized by most social institutions in villages being supplanted by the local branch of the political party. And Manoranjan Vyapari echoes this in his autobiography when how he tried to how he was a part of an initiative of a rickshaw puller union, which was faced repression by the state because it was not authorized by the party. So we agree that party society system, which forms the scaffolding of left governance in Bengal, has enabled its long dominance in the state. However, we diverge from the reading that places the party as the primary unit of analysis with respect to left rule in Bengal and ignores the caste character of this party society. From our above given arguments and narratives, it is clear that the party completely dominated the public sphere. It was very much embedded in caste dynamics. In a caste society, the detriment of overemphasizing the party is an epistemic erasure of the question of caste and the Bhadralok character of the left leadership, replicating the same strategy that the Bhadralok left has adopted for several decades to cement its hegemony. Through Luke's typology of power, we have shown how caste hegemony operates in multiple spheres in different complex ways, reducing this caste hegemony to the binaries of upper caste conspiracies and unintended consequences of left rule for electoral dividends, as contended by Oyan Guha, is extremely simplistic and reductionist. It erases the myriad ways in which caste dynamics operate in a caste society like that of Bengal and precludes a critical investigation into the castelessness discourse perpetuated by the Bhadralok left. The CPIM passed a resolution at the All India Convention on the Problems of Dalits in 2006, summing up the multidimensional structural violence. However, the refusal to acknowledge the structural discrimination perpetuated by the Bhadralok left in Bengal and the deleterious effect that fictional castelessness discourse had on the progress of the anti-caste movement in Bengal is a stark reminder of their Brahminism. Meg?
Just to conclude our discussion, it is interesting to note that Ambedkar's comment on the CPI, originally being dominated by Brahmin boys, fits well when read in relation to the context of the Bhadralok leadership of the left regime in Bengal. Further, Ambedkar also commented that the secular Brahmin and the priestly Brahmin are essentially the same, and the secular Brahmin would never participate in a movement against the priestly Brahmin or to annihilate caste per se, because it would mean the erosion of their social privileges and prestige. The Bhadralok dominated left leadership's aversion towards the question of caste to essentially perpetuate its hegemony can be viewed through this lens. Thus, we see how the perpetuation of the discourse of castelessness served as an effective strategy to obfuscate their hegemony and elide the caste question in Bengal. We would just like to acknowledge and just put this on record. We are extremely grateful to Kollani Thakur Charal, Manoranjan Vyapari, Manohar Moli Biswas, Professor Kalyan Kumar Das, Professor Shubhajit Noshkar, Adil Biswas, and Joydeep Datta for speaking to us despite their busy schedules. Their critical views and valuable inputs have deeply sort of enriched our understanding during the process of writing this paper. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions in the Q&A session.
Thank you to both Mohimarnab and Chandrasekhar for that very thoughtful, extremely powerful paper. And of course, the busting of the myth of castelessness in Bengal has for some time been on the agenda. To extend that to left rule in Bengal is obviously a hugely important exercise. There's no question. And I suppose there is a continuity between the earlier paper and this paper to the extent that it poses questions of class with caste in your case. So it would be interesting to see how these two papers could, if it at all could, talk to each other. We will now move to the third paper, which is by Rajat Roy. And Rajat Roy, not Rajat Ray, which is an interesting, it gave me a bit of a shock, I have to say, when I first read the program. Rajat Roy is an assistant professor at Presidency University, Kolkata. He's currently working on contemporary Dalit literature in Bengal. He is interested in continental philosophy and political theology. His paper is called Postcolonial Theory and its Outcastes, Reading Social Visions of Anti-Caste Thinkers in Colonial Bengal. Rajat.
Thank you, Professor Sen, for that kind introduction. And yes, the Rajat Kantore, I had to hear that a lot at Presidency since the time I joined. But before I begin, I sincerely apologize that this paper, as it is titled initially, is something which I'll not be kind of doing because of the paucity of time. The title suggests that part of the paper is to deal with evaluating post-colonial theory, especially in the question of caste and representing Dalit political subjectivity, focusing on the social visions of certain minor sects, subaltern sects here, low caste sects. I am nevertheless going to talk about a critical evaluation of that post-colonial theory on the question of caste, but that would be kind of coming either in the question and answer session, or it will be partly reflected while I address the central questions of the paper, especially on the epistemic choice I make to read the social visions of the minor sects in mid-19th century. So the minor sector I study, so I'll primarily focus on two elements. First, I'll talk about the questions for the central questions for this paper. Secondly, I'll be talking about how was Renaissance be like? Like how should we look at Renaissance as a kind of social reform period in Bengal in the 19th century? How should we study that particular period? And vis-a-vis that, late 19th century also kind of provided us with kind of other kind of genre of thinking which is completely ignored even in historical studies as well. So I don't want to look into the historical kind of evolution of anti-caste thinking. Rather, I would look at the texts which were produced mostly in the early 20th century, but on the thinkers of late 19th century, almost contemporary to Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. So we might have a kind of conversation kind of mode of paper here between, let's say, Bankim, Ram Mohan, the great kind of figures of Bengal, and vis-a-vis someone who remains as a marginal minor sect and untouchable in the real sense of the term, even in academic domain. So it's a kind of social vision vis-a-vis the Renaissance project of Bengal. So the questions for this paper are: how did Bengal Renaissance and social reform movement of early 19th century accommodate caste question? Secondly, is there a distinction between the anti-caste, here Matua? Matua is a minor sect which emerged in the 1870s. Anti-caste here Matua, social vision, and the upper caste-led social reformation project in Bengal. This is an important question considering the scholarly intervention on 19th century reformist thinking and nationalist ideologies in the later period are broadly developed from the life worlds and visions of the upper caste thinkers and activists. And this is actually kind of the suggestion which I was making about post-colonial theory, whether post-colonial theory, nationalist historians, their works have primarily focused on the other side, this upper caste thinkers and the activists. It is in this context we need to ask whether the Matuas and their social vision emerge as a self-conscious community within the larger framework of Hindu society, or was it envisioning an alternative community outside Hinduism? So the first part is called Renaissance, social reform and the caste question. 19th century Bengal is often associated with the age of social and religious reform, and also claimed to be the age of Renaissance. At the backdrop of colonial milieu, the Bengalis came into direct contact with the West in the late 18th and early 19th century, with the Western Orientalist scholars constructing historical knowledge on the Hindu past. The newly formed native intelligentsia reinterpreted and started arranging their own history and geography within this new framework of knowledge. It is within this Orientalist ideology 19th century socio-religious movement arose. It looked at the Middle Age as the Dark Age and overlooked the pre-colonial heterodox tradition of the masses. Drawing from the Western historical knowledge, it considered that the pre-colonial society and politics was violent, oppressive, arbitrary, slavish in nature, and the existing religion, presumably Hindu, as obscurantist and superstitious. This I quote from Panikka. The solution for this newly Western educated elite was to weight the new Enlightenment ideology with that of the West and that of the indigenous moral of the East. Renaissance or rebirth is located at this precise sphere of general change in the colonial society, while the golden age of the past is found within the episteme of Brahmanic Hinduism, which I must mention, which remain unquestioned even in post-colonial historiographic tradition of studying nationalist history in India, especially when the study comes on Bankim, and yet compatible with the Western ideals like that of rationalism, cosmopolitanism. Ancient Brahminical ideals like the Vedantic monotheism serve this purpose quite well. This is one of the key reasons why Shumit Sarkar expressed his concern on whether the dominant ideology of Reformation symbolizes any real break or not. In the process of reviving Vedantic Hinduism, the vast number of the masses and their heterodox religions and practices were absolutely silenced or at best appropriated. Even Ram Mohan Roy's contribution at best be called as the restorer of rational and moral basis of Hinduism and not society as a whole. Thus, the attempt of the Renaissance ideologues like Ram Mohan Roy, Akshay Kumar Datta, Keshav Chandra Sen, Vidyasagar, Devendranath Tagore, we can talk in detail maybe in the discussion session about them, and the reformist associations like Brahmo Samaj and its several variants, Tattvabodhani Sabha, did not only operate within the framework of classical Hinduism, which accommodated worldly asceticism, as David Goff has argued, it also failed to voice concerns for all. They definitely did envision an idea of universality and formal equality within the fold of Vedantic Hinduism, but failed to provide so in practice. The fractions and rifts in 1866 first and then again in 1878 in the history of Brahmo Samaj are one of the best examples of this. The stark differences between two of its leaders, Keshav Chandra Sen and Devendranath Tagore, on the question of intercaste marriage, renouncing sacred trade, Kulin polygamy, and the Brahminical customs of child marriage, etc., are the nature of and limitations of upper caste reform project. The main concern for Tagore was not to alienate caste Hindus. Since its inception, the Samaj spoke the mind of the upper caste, and reforms were initiated only to the extent it did not go against the grain of existing social structure. Tattvabodhani Sabha also foregrounded a new Vedantic philosophy in order to represent upper caste thinking and justified an eclectic version of bourgeois Hinduism. Both these associations represent a position of convenience rather than change in the existing social structure. This new Vedantic thinking was new because it modified earlier Vedantic position on Brahminical renunciation and asceticism in order to attain supreme knowledge as developed by Shankaracharya. The Sabha's reinterpretation of Upanishad aimed at justifying the members' worldly economic success, which was like newly found in the time of colonial, colonial rule, because this is the subsection, as last paper also talked about briefly about Bhadralok. So this is the section we're thinking about. Their worldly success could be weighed with kind of theistic principle of which is to kind of retain the social supremacy as they enjoyed it in the previous time as well. Similar trends can also be seen in the thinking of Ram Mohan, who is considered to be a polymath scholar and skilled polemicist, and yet his caste purity remained intact, and he talked against it only as a mere act of tokenism. Tokenism is the term used by Boehmer. He modified age-old caste-based dharma and renounced the theory of karma, and yet often found citing Shankaracharya Manu in defense of his position on knowledge and contemplation. Moreover, to him, caste differences only became a concern while talking of patriotism and unity, similar the case with Bankim. Or in no possible way was his thinking driven by a sense of social justice. To sum up, the analytical scope of Renaissance thinking was limiting on two grounds. Firstly, even though the Reformation project was extremely critical of the social and religious conservatives of its time, it failed to move beyond Orientalist categories of knowledge and script-based tradition of Hinduism and Brahmanism. This script-based tradition and script-based reading of history is a very, it's a deeply Brahmanical practice, which has been pointed out by contemporary scholars like Gopal Guru, Gail Omvet in many of their works. No way we see any difference when we look at the works of Ram Mohan, or we look at the works of Keshav Chandra Sen, or let's say Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, the figures of Bengal Renaissance and nationalism later. It was an upper caste-led movement, and the key intervention of the thinkers of this age were to revive the Brahminical traditions and reinterpret the Vedantic scriptures only to fit into the Western conceptions of progress. Ram Mohan Roy, the founding father of Bengal Renaissance, was a rationalist and a scripturalist at the same time. His praxis solely dependent on the rereading of the ancient Upanishads, as it provided him with a familiar hermeneutic rationale. So what is the source of this knowledge, this Renaissance knowledge, is something we need to think about. And this hermeneutic rationale, this familiar hermeneutic rationale for Ram Mohan was to critique the Orthodox Hindus of his time, but also it guarded him against any allegations which could have been made against him to be a non-believer or an astika. So this is one, and the second one is that, and most crucially, the social vision and the scope of Bengal Renaissance could not accommodate the heterodox anti-Vedic ideology of the masses existing from pre-colonial period. Even if the upper caste-led Renaissance ideology promised to provide a universality of religion accessible to all, in practice they could not create such condition because of the all-pervasive caste hierarchy. The very nature of Renaissance discourse was reconciliatory. I want to emphasize on this word reconciliatory. Because this is where I think the Matua vision departs, because this discourse was reconciliatory of the contending social forces within the colonial situation and in Brahmanical Hinduism. In the later decades, such ideology not only reconciled with Aryan racial theory. Bankim has a very small piece written called as Caste in Lower Bengal. In that piece, this is exactly what we see, and it's exactly where the weight between Bengali upper caste intelligentsia and the colonial Orientalist scholars of the then colonial Orientalist scholars, whether although this is the stance Bankim takes, which follows that racial origin theory of Risley, etc. Propagated by Orientalists in order to retain its power over the socially marginalized by reforming Brahmanic Hinduism, it also absorbed and co-opted many dissenting sects, for example, Vaishnavism with its own fold. Thus, the language of social justice never found a voice within the dominant discourse of reformation and cultural nationalism. Instead of the socially marginalized laying down the course for justice and equality, it was either the colonial or the native elites who decided on their fate. This process made the low castes as passive recipients or silent subjects of the Reformation and later in the nationalist project. The social visions and claims for justice could not find any analytical space within the fragmented inner or outer schema of nationalist thinking. Low caste remained as forbidden outsiders, as untouchables, as Bahishkrut Bharat for the nationalists. And I don't think this framework of inner and outer does operate at all when we look at the untouchable bodies. These bodies remain as a complete outsider, as a stranger to this, this post-colonial schema of looking at nationalists of this time through the lens of inner and outer. Anti-caste, now the second part, anti-caste social vision in the 19th century. The period between 17th to 19th centuries witnessed as many as 56 heterodox sects in Bengal. And these emerged as a response to Brahminical dominance and not necessarily against colonial force at an everyday local level. However, several measures were taken to co-opt Vaishnavism and other deviant sects within Brahminical Hinduism. The most notable example is Gauriya Vaishnavism, which happened, I think, in Keturi festival. So the Gauriya Vaishnavism emerged, which helped the upper caste to retain religious purity intact even after participating in the ideology of the masses. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the evolution of Vaishnavism with numerous rifts and appropriations, even by the reformists, we can think about figures like Bankim, one of the best example, and also Akshay Kumar Datta, is an exemplary history of the evolution of victorious Brahmanism against numerous contestations arose from the subaltern sections. The eclectic teachings of Balaharis, these are all minor sects, Balahari sects, the ecstatic thinking of Kartabhajas, the infancy and Chaitanya Bhakti of Balok Das, it's another sect, and the work-oriented Puritanic ideology of the Matuas. All these are attempts to be read as stories of repeated failure because they got appropriated, and yet these made a mark on the face of Brahminical culture and edifice in the 19th century. Because part of this paper is also due for publication, because this is where I try to reflect on that. Can there be, how far has Dalit literature changed from the time of 19th century to now, late 19th century till now. And I think this keeping a mark on the face of Brahmanism is this perfect example of, if you look into the evolution of Dalit literature, low caste literature, and their social visions. So the social vision of Matuas, as reflected in Sri Sri Hari Lilamrito, is that Hari Lilamrito is a text which was written on the life of Harichat Thakur. Harichat Thakur is the founder of Matua sect. The history of the Matuas is by and large linked with the caste position and economic status of the Namashudras, who were erstwhile Chandals in Bengal. In the 1870s, the newly formed religious sect, subversively called Matua, helped in introducing solidarity among the untouchables. Harichat Thakur, born as a Chandal and a follower of popular Sahajiya Vaishnavism, once experienced self-revolution and started gathering followers for his simplistic preaching of non-ritualistic devotions. The key text on the life of Harichat, on the philosophy of Matua religion, Sri Sri Hari Lilamrito, was written by one of the disciples of Harichat Thakur, Tarak Chandra Sarkar, in 1960. Since the text is first written account on the preaching and sermons of Harichat, all the Matua devotees considered it as a sacred text beyond literary value. The whole text is divided into 6 parts, written in the format of a medieval epic, Mangal Kavya, with numerous tales and miraculous achievements of Harichat. Despite the fact that the emergence of the Matua sect owed much to an ideology of protest, as Shekhar Bandyopadhyay brilliantly argued, against the upper caste dominance in social and religious and economic sphere, in Tarak Chandra Sarkar's depiction of Harichat, one hardly finds any radical anti-caste gestures against Hinduism and Brahmanism. The usual pattern for this low caste literature and their social visions in the late 19th century and early 20th century was either to follow appropriative narrative within the fold of Brahmanism, as is seen in Darpan literature. Sumit Sarkar has fascinating work on this. Darpan literature, Namashudra Darpan was basically early 20th century literature. And similarly, we can also see some of the low caste literature also subverts upper caste claims. Hari Lilamrito is a text also could not overcome this tension between appropriation and subversion, between nearness to Brahmanic origin myth and their lived social reality as segregated untouchables. So this book documents many sermons Harichat gave to his followers. Even though the book aspires for equality and justice to be the driving principle, one hardly finds any general root map. Not only does it fail to locate the origin of caste violence that Harichat experienced, the solution to it is also very limiting. The author's devotion and stunning imagination not only framed Harichand as a true avatar and restorer of Hinduism with Brahminical ancestry, lapsed ancestry, it creates doubt in the minds of readers as to why Matua as a sect, as a separate one from Brahmanism, created at all. But if one does a selective reading and analyzes the social vision of Harichand Thakur, the same text I'm talking about, so I'm trying to give two ways to read this text, and one sees that something completely different opening up, a kind of inconsistency one can see within the text, and same thing happens, which I'll not have time to talk about, which is actually on his son's life, Guruchand Thakur, whom many lower castes and even many works are nowadays getting done to call Guruchand Thakur as the first reformers, who is actually a true reformer to the lower caste. So he is like considered to be the Renaissance figure to the low caste, and not Ram Mohan or political in an anti-caste political gesture. They are not considered to be as true reformers or as true kind of reformists, Renaissance figures. So Guruchand's text also, Guruchand Chorit, both the texts, Hari Lilamrita and Guruchand Chorit, is actually having this inconsistency. So I'll just talk about Hari Lilamrita, and I think historians like Shumit Sarkar completely ignored this aspect of social visions as depicted in Hari Lilamrita. Present day Dalit literature is largely dependent on this side of the text to locate a discourse of social dignity. In Hari Lilamrita, one can locate an apparent paradox between anti-caste social vision of Harichand pitted against the appropriated life narrative depicted by the author. In the sermons, Harichand boldly criticized renunciatory devotion as prevalent among the Vaishnavas, and encouraged instead a worldly devotion in keeping with materialistic vision. Unlike Kartavajas, he advised in favor of householders' life and rejected any form of illicit relations and ritualistic initiation or priestcraft. Going against the grain of Vedic religion, Harichand rejected the practices of yajna, the theory of otherworldliness, karma, religious spells which are prevalent among the upper caste. Within these egalitarian promises, his declaration, Vinno Sampradaya Mora Matua Akhan, that is a separate story of the Matuas, seems to indicate a future which did not get symbolized in the general composition of Hari Lilamrita and in the low caste politics in Bengal. After Harichand, his son also took certain direction or certain action in terms of attaining this kind of promises which Harichand makes. So the philosophy, I'll just finish in 1 minute. The philosophy of Matua here is an openly anti-Vedic, and these two texts which I could not talk about. One is the Guruchand Chorit. The philosophy of Matua is openly anti-Vedic and anti-Vedantic or script-based religion. It followed the philosophy of this worldliness and a materialistic conception of life and progress. The moral principles of the Matua sect were in no way similar to the Vedantic doctrines like Karma, Maya, Brahma, revived by the upper caste Bengalis of early 19th century. Matua emerged from a negated social of Hindu social order and had a polarized view, and yet it was universal and egalitarian in its promise. Once we read the sermons, kind of depicted in the text, we see this is what is reflected. Anyone and everyone could be a Matua by chanting the name of Hari. There is no hierarchy in society, no forward, no backward caste. It envisages a community of equals tied by devotion and yet motivated to work for individuals, not for individuals but for collective success. I think this has a lot kind of implication in terms of the future direction, which actually kind of Dalit politics, Dalit literature in Bengal takes, especially in the over the period of last 30 years. And this Matua principles, this philosophy, the other side of the text, or the inconsistency, gives birth to this kind of contemporary kind of political expression. The way Matua is in itself is a divided community on political line, on social line, in terms of literary expressions. I think it has a lot to do with the way these texts are imagined, they were talking about, and the inconsistencies are being perceived. Just to give one example, I'm just really sorry, just one example is this lapped Brahmin ancestry, with which the book begins. So in the book, just one small addition, which was Shekhar Bandyopadhyay says as a later day addition, but as a trained political scientist, what I see is that the present day Matua division or the bifurcation of Matua sect is actually dependent on this particular addition of this word of lapsed Brahmin ancestry of Harichand's forefather. Just this simple addition caused a community to kind of bifurcate into two completely different terrain is like how people perceive it, how they look into this text as a kind of source of social dignity for them, because they kind of, some of them, they kind of start having a discussion on Sanskritized origin or Brahminical origin. Another is like completely denounce or renounce Brahminical origin altogether, and it's a kind of mistaken way of perceiving the text. Thank you so much. I'm really sorry for exceeding 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rajat. That was an absolutely fascinating paper, and really the comparison is, I think, what really foregrounds some of the issues that you laid out for us in the beginning. There could be many, of course, you've opened up a great deal of space for discussion. I was thinking when you were speaking about the Renaissance figures and their Vedantic commitments, that perhaps of the few of the people you mentioned, one might want to separate Keshavchandra Sen from the others because of the Christian overt flirtations with Christianity, and what difference that would have made to Keshavchandra Sen's position vis-a-vis the others, who are much more singularly attached to Vedantic scholarship and religion. That might be an interesting kind of question. Also, to heterogenize the elite Renaissance rather than to treat it as a monolith, vis-a-vis the equally heterogeneous non-elite social reform movement that you're talking about. And of course, there is a gender question here. I will not raise it just now. So we'll move to the next paper, and I apologize to Rohit and to Keshav for being a hopeless chair in terms of keeping time. We are running very, very late. But what to do? These are such wonderful papers.
I have been keeping time, Shumtadi, but it's just that I can't suddenly ask him to keep quiet, so which is why I'm just being patient.
Okay, great. We now have Shreya. Shreya Patnaik will speak on shifting modes of collective memory and popular culture in the reconstruction and reimagination of Mahari Devdasis, a critical analysis of gender, subalternity, and human rights projects in 20th century India. And Shreya is a doctoral student in international history at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. Her research is funded by the Swiss Government Excellence Scholarship. Her PhD research focuses on the historical genealogy surrounding discourses of trafficking, prostitution, and sex worker rights in India through the lens of matriarchal communities like Mahari Devdasis. She uses oral histories along with archival records, and she's currently working with collections from the UN and ILO archives. Besides her academic interests, Shreya has actively worked in the public policy and development sectors in India on gender and human rights initiatives. I am eagerly awaiting Shreya's paper. Shreya.
Thank you so much, Professor Sen. At the very outset, I apologize if there's a slight wind static because of my table fan, because of the heat, and I hope it's not too loud or bothering anybody. Can I ask if everybody can see my PowerPoint?
We can all see, yeah.
Yes,
no
we can see it.
Just give me a second while I just adjust it to the full screen, and then we can. Sorry, just one quick second while I screen this. Sorry. Rohit, or does anyone know how I can turn this on to full screen?
There should be an option, right?
I think there's on the. Yeah.
Besides that, slideshow.
Slideshow, yeah, I think the slideshow will help.
Sorry,
Beside two, on the menu tab option, one option, slideshow. Yes,
Yes.
over there. Now play from start. Play from start.
Okay.
Then you can use your arrows to control.
Okay, wonderful. Sorry for the. Okay, so I will start. So this presentation is part of my ongoing PhD research, which focuses on the historical genealogy surrounding prostitution and trafficking regulations in India through the matriarchal community of temple dancers called Mahari Devadasis. Under the colonial disciplining of deviant sexualities, together with racial biopolitics across the British Empire, these actors were conceptualized, categorized, and criminalized as religious prostitutes under contagious disease and prostitution regulation from the 19th century onwards. However, the abolition of this matriarchal tradition, instead of improving women's life circumstances, propelled a turn towards menial jobs in the informal sectors, owing to their growing stigmatization in the modern Indian nation state, along with lack of employment options in the market economy. In problematizing human rights discourses surrounding this now extinct community in post-colonial Orissa, my research delineates how legal statutes on Devadasi abolition silence minority voices by distorting the complex relationship between informal economies of sexual commerce, women's socioeconomic autonomy, and bodily agency. As upon the extinction of the Mahari Devadasi community in 2015, my interviews and interactions with the last living Mahari Shashimani Devi, along with regional informants in Orissa, consequently epitomize important catalysts of socio-political and cultural change. Such experiential narratives from the marginalia can contest top-down colonial and nationalist categorizations of Devadasi dedication by incorporating the complex historical subjectivities of matriarchal actors who were situated outside of patriarchal kinship structures. I'll start with some background to the topic. Before British annexation of India, the matriarchal community of temple dancers, also known as Devadasis, inhabited and performed religious services in Hindu temples. They were socially not bound to the institution of marriage and being wed to Hindu deities in their practices of religiosity. They formed local communities known by different names in different areas. For example, Maharis in Orissa, Jogatis or Basapis in Karnataka, Theravadars in Tamil Nadu, Natis in Assam, Matangis or Muralis in Maharashtra, Bhavans or Kalavans in the Konkan region, and Bogams in Andhra Pradesh. They were the creators of Indian classical dance forms like Bharatnatyam, Odissi, and Kuchipudi. Their practices of religiosity and quotidian cultures varied across regions. In particular, Devadasis in the Jagannath temple of Orissa, also known as Maharis, intrinsically differed in their ritualistic traditions, sociocultural customs, and kinship ties from other regional variants of temple dancer communities. As studied by scholars in the topic like Frederick Appel Margolin, Lucinda Ramberg, Davesh Soneji, and Amrit Srinivasan, unlike parts of southern and western India, where historical evidence alludes to trafficking and coerced prostitution from such poor low-caste families using the rhetoric of religion, Maharis were respected cultural figures who enjoyed religious and royal patronage and were the historical creators of the dance form Odissi. They received a regular maintenance allowance from the Jagannath Temple's funds and were granted temple lands in Orissa, which were later confiscated into the landed estates of the colonial state. And these factors have been studied in detail by Frederick Margolin and also sort of highlighted by census surveys and entitlement records pertaining to the Jagannath Temple. As the system mandated a Devadasi's property to be inherited by a biological or adopted daughter to continue the lineage, these women exercised greater socioeconomic agency and bodily autonomy over most groups of married women in the social landscape of Orissa. Thus, against a conservative nexus of family values in Orissa, where women's roles were traditionally confined to domesticity and motherhood, Maharis exercised greater access to the public sphere. My attempt here is not to overtly romanticize this community via aspects of agency. As Mahari Devadasis were situated outside the heteronormative framework of marriage, it is certainly true that some women had royal patrons or partners who contributed towards them financially or in the form of gifts. However, their social status was not defined as commercial sex workers as is done today, but cultural actors as female priests, dance teachers, musicians, or courtesans. This was confirmed to me in my interviews with the last living Mahari Shashimani Devi, who reiterated that these women did not need to engage in sexual transactions out of an economic need, as they were financially compensated for their seva, that is ritualistic services, via allowances, landed estates, along with daily food in the form of Mahaprasad Bhogo, which is the sacred food offerings to the temple deities. In my conversations with Sir Shashimani, she further alluded to the strict rules of purity guiding their quotidian practices within the temple's rules and record of rites. The term Dusita Pebhara in Oriya refers to the stigma of prostitution historically. In the observed code of conduct, once classified as Dusita, that is, impure and polluted by engaging in forms of commercial sex work, Maharis were no longer allowed to participate in religious rituals and extricated from the Jagannath temple's political economy. Shashimani's assertion that Guriye Akhi Amaku Jogi Achanti Taki Amedusita Naho is particularly enlightening. This translates from Oriya to, quote unquote, there are many watchful eyes over our code of conduct so that we do not become polluted in the public eye. Shashimani discussed two such women who were excommunicated from the Mahari Devdasi community for engaging in certain forms of sexual commerce. Their sexual agency can thus be argued to assume a certain liminality, where Maharis did assume a choice in their nature of patrons and relationships, but only under the overarching structure of the temple edifice. This rendered onto women a circumscribed nature of autonomy to maneuver through existing patriarchal structures, albeit carving out limited public roles for themselves. It is also worth mentioning here that despite a strong history of Devadasi dedication in the eastern states of Orissa and Assam, there were no legal state movements towards abolition of these practices here, as like the various abolitionist legislations across the states of Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, or Andhra Pradesh. These include the Tamil Nadu Devadasis Prevention of Dedication Act of 1947, the Karnataka Devadasis Prohibition of Dedication Act of 1982, the Andhra Pradesh Devadasis Prohibition of Dedication Act of 1988, and the Maharashtra Devadasi System Abolition Act of 2005. This was reiterated to me in my interviews with various interlocutors in Puri, who stated that select elements of Devadasi traditions, including but not limited to their song and dance ritual at festivals like the Ratha Jatra, Chandan Jatra, Jhulan Jatra, or Navakalivar, continued right up till the 2000s. In addition, the extinction of this community in 2015 was also characterized by shifts in collective memory and popular culture in terms of a select amnesia and cultural nostalgia in Orissa. Such mutating configurations in popular culture and collective memory, especially with the demise of this community, could be rooted in a select terrain of cultural romanticization and societal remembrance and are consequential to trace. Now, in terms of the site of historical inquiry, the Jagannath temple in Puri, that is in the present-day state of Orissa, as one of the 4 Char Dhams, that is sacred pilgrimage sites, is one of the most revered shrines in the history of Hindu religion. It is marked by phenomenal wealth, religious endowments, national and diasporic networks. The political economy of the temple becomes an important sub-theme of study through its varying periods of gendered alterations, which my PhD research does. Now, colonial strategic interests over the Jagannath temple were primarily driven by economic reasons in accessing the temple funds and the pilgrim tax. The pilgrim tax being a religious tax levied on pilgrims traveling to Puri for festivals. It also tied into a socio-political function towards strengthening administrative control over the eastern region of Orissa, along with normalizing Victorian social norms across parts of the empire. In Eurocentric civilizing mission discourses, such matriarchal actors were constructed as an archetype of social deviance, criminality, backwardness, and superstition deemed intrinsic to Hindu religion and culture, particularly through their practices of religiosity, socioeconomic autonomy, and matrilineal inheritance. Devadasis therefore posed a direct threat to puritanical gendered norms of domesticity, passive sexuality, and patriarchy that were being safeguarded in 19th century Britain against an emergent feminist consciousness. The civilizational metaphor was a central component in positing the Devadasi both as an agent of moral disorder and a social victim. Additionally, this decree criminalized caste, posed a direct threat to the health and morality of the British Empire, which, quote unquote, exercised a humanitarian duty to save the lives of such women, help them contract irregular marriage, alongside eradicate the moral danger they pose to society, unquote. The social landscape characterizing Devadasi dedication was orientalized in light of such racialized biopolitics. Now, in terms of historical disruptors, the passage of sections 372 and 373 of the Indian Penal Code implemented in 1860 and the Contagious Diseases Act from 1864 onwards homogeneously grouped the practices of all temple dancers in the British Raj as deviant and immoral, with the practice of the tradition declared as a punishable offense. In the anti-Nach movement, Devadasis were extricated from the historical sites of performativity and instead disenfranchised as sex workers or religious prostitutes. The two dichotomized representations, either as a victim of abuse or a sexually immoral profiteer, stripped women of the autonomy to define their vocational status in their own terms, even when their daily lives defied colonial nomenclatures. Such legislations also ignored regional pluralisms across temple dancer communities and differences in quotidian cultures. However, while the Mahari, that is the female tradition, was regulated under prostitution and contagious disease laws, the Gotipua, that is the male tradition, continued to flourish in Orissa. Gotipuas were young boys who were recruited prior to the coming of puberty, marked by their high-pitched voices and ability to enact feminine dance movements. They were compared to boy players who performed in British playhouses like Shakespeare's Globe when women were outlawed from acting on stage. So this, in a sense, demarcates the mapping of gendered roles from the theatrical stages of Imperial Britain to the temple spaces of India. Subsequently, the Prevention of Dedication Act, enacted in the Madras Legislative Assembly in independent India in 1947, imbibed colonial nomenclatures in the articulation of a pedagogical ideal for respectable citizenship. Consequently, following the abolition of the system in nationwide regulation laws, Devadasis were forbidden from performing religious rituals alongside extricated from temple revenues. Furthermore, to preserve the reputation of temple spaces, Indian nationalists appropriated imperial paradigms whereby the legacy of Victorian gendered norms was normalized and institutionalized in the making of the independent nation state. However, the abolition of this custom, instead of improving women's life circumstances, propelled a turn towards clandestine networks of sex work, owing to their rising socioeconomic marginalization in the absence of any concrete measures for skill development or integration into the market economy. This slide here is an archival document of the Madras Devadasi Abolition Act. Now, one cannot understand the legal predicament of social norms in contemporary South Asian societies without a historical analysis of the problem. A mapping of gender relations from the colonial to the post-colonial, which normalized marriage as the predominant establishment for sexual behaviors, shapes the crux of this argument. This stems from a Eurocentric human rights vocabulary in what Ashish Nandi calls, quote unquote, the psychological impact of colonialism. The dangers that minority actors pose to the national project thus justified coercive and oftentimes intrusive projects at bodily disciplining like those in lock hospitals. The correction of women's sexualities thus constituted the epistemological and ontological principle against which pedagogical ideals of respectable citizenship were constructed. The abolitionist movements addressed before further delineate how the Devadasi reforms were enshrined in a pedagogical vision that was embedded in protecting women, integrating them into domesticating roles, disciplining bodies, and criminalizing deviant sexualities. In fact, Muthu Lakshmi Reddy, one of the leading female reformers of the 20th century, was at the forefront of abolishing the Devadasi system and integrating these women as chaste housewives or deferential maidservants along middle-class patriarchal principles. The patriarchal consensus in the nationalist movement thus asserted a distinct gendered habitus for women, thereby systematically marginalizing the quotidian cultures of matriarchal communities. Along these lines, nationalist responses by Indian elites entailed a mythicization and reimagination of an ancient puritanical culture, which emphasized a cleansing of the temple dancer's body and extrication from her historical sites of religiosity towards purifying the disrepute associated with Hinduism. However, This sanitized, reconstructed version ignored Hinduism's diverse heteroglot elements like the Sakta tradition in Orissa, whereby certain women exercise socioeconomic agency, cultural capital, and access to the public sphere. Legal judgments in post-colonial India are reflective of this, whereby the daughters of Maharis were subject to various forms of institutional discrimination. Take, for instance, the legal case of Devadasi Haripriya's daughter that went on from 1983 to 1990 in the Orissa High Court. Here, Haripriya's daughter, despite not being a Devadasi, was disallowed from inheriting her mother's estate as she was unmarried and assumed to be quote-unquote exercising immoral relations with men under the Indecent Representation of Women Act of 1986, again a derivative of colonial civil law. Ironically enough, in the revival of the classical dances along a bourgeois respectability, upper-class sensibility in post-colonial India, Maharis like Haripriya, Kokila Prabha, Parasamani, or Shashimani did not gain prominence in the making of Odissi as the formative gurus, which were now Gotipuas and male dance maestros. In the appropriation of their dance ritual, certain elements of performative devotionalism, sensuality, and eroticism in Abhinay facial gestures and bodily movements was sanitized from the reconstructed vocabulary to pander to liberalized middle-class audiences. The present-day form of the Devadasi system, although extinct in Orissa, still exists across several states in western and southern India, and it's devolved into a form of commercial sex work, whereby despite the abolition of this tradition, several ex-Devadasis are now located on the fringes of civil society with scarce literacy levels. Without any concrete skill development options or governmental initiatives towards vocational training and employment, many sustain themselves and their children through prostitution. The remaining Devadasis across the states of Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, or Tamil Nadu live in abject poverty and conditions of precariousness, bereft of any social security benefits, access to education, healthcare, or literacy rights. Their present-day situation has therefore evolved from an elite cultural practice into a form of ritual sexualized labor. I now want to move on to say that this topic is of particular significance in the present times, as in 2015, the last Mahari Shashimani Devi passed away. Media channels presented this as a defining historical moment, the extinction of an age-old community that had died due to the perpetuation of archaic patriarchal laws. While their dance ritual has been immortalized in performative culture through Odissi, now performed in several local, national, and international stages, the inventors of this art form have been in gradual decline since the 19th century. Drawing on transnational feminist movements, the 21st century has concomitantly witnessed regional resistance movements in Orissa to advocate for equal citizenship rights of this community. In the transition from the colonial to the post-colonial, although the patriarchal framework of Devadasi laws has remained intact, popular culture and memory about this community has drastically changed. Mahari identity in recent moments of solidarity constitutes an expansive transnational collective, including Odissi dance professionals, social activists, humanitarian workers, religious authorities, and legal advocates, all of which epitomize mutating forms of collective memory and popular culture. This case study also shows how in today's globalizing world, sources of visual and performative culture constitute powerful information channels that transgress the hegemonic narratives of nation states and can be used by minority actors to reclaim citizenship. Global culture is provided for a novel form of memorization where the cultural capital of Devadasis is transmitted beyond national frontiers. Take, for example, the La Bayadere ballet performed in theaters across the world as shown on the slide. This revolves around the life of a temple dancer and incorporates elements of Indian classical dances into ballet techniques. The adoption of Devadasi art onto international stages has also been accompanied by its dissemination to a global audience via films and social media, which is important to study. I want to end by examining the role of what Arjun Appadurai terms as global cultural flows in situating indigenous struggles within the ambit of global human rights conventions. By analyzing minority voices along with civil society movements, this research elucidates a rising collective identity around the figure of the Devadasi in the 21st century. Take, for example, the NGO called Darbar Mahila Samanvay Committee, constituting of many former Devadasis and contemporary sex workers in West Bengal, who advocate for the legalization of the prostitution industry today, as they believe that its underground nature enhances networks of crime and simultaneous worker stigmatization. Darbar's film project, Tales of the Night Fairies, records the life stories of sexual minorities towards exploring the collective organization of disenfranchised groups, together with feminist non-abolitionist NGOs to advocate for their legal and healthcare rights. It was featured on international platforms like the Asian Film Festival in Rome, Association for Women's Rights and Development International Forum in Mexico, and the San Francisco Sex Worker Film Festival, thereby mobilizing feminist organizations globally towards sex worker rights. So here, the mediascape and technoscape have been pivotal in molding a dynamic Devadasi identity that has gained newfound meanings across time in a departure from nomenclatures of religious trafficking or prostitution. Such channels prove quintessential towards understanding an emergent feminist and subaltern consciousness. I want to conclude by briefly examining the significance of this topic. Firstly, it informs a revisionist historiography through a bottom-up reading of female agency, community solidarity, and resistance against patriarchal kinship networks in pre-colonial matriarchal societies. Secondly, it provincializes the Eurocentrism in colonial and national women's rights interventions, which critically informed international humanitarian frameworks in the aftermath of empires, like the UN, the League of Nations, or the ILO. Finally, a granular study of subalternity through oral histories, experiential accounts, and performative culture illustrates how certain matriarchal communities challenge patriarchal structures through their social, cultural, and quotidian practices. This approach also incorporates the voices of sexual minorities in the making of laws, developments, and policy paradigms. Finally, my PhD research therefore aims at deconstructing the historical processes that brought about a systemic stigmatization of gendered or sexual minorities across post-colonial societies in South Asia, and incorporation of such intersectional concerns into the workings of international development organizations today. Through a critical examination of the politics of marginalization for such actors who live on the fringes of civil society, this research will hopefully contribute towards transnational discourses on subalternity along with women's activist movements in the global south. As I conclude, I do hope this case study leaves you all to ponder on one question. After all, what is human rights without taking into account minority rights? Thank you.
Thank you, Shreya. That was absolutely fascinating. There were two things that kept coming in and out of my head as you were speaking. One is about a little more clarity, perhaps, about your definition of matriarchy. In what sense do you, because there could be various kinds of ways in which one could describe these communities, and exactly by what criterion are they matriarchal, given that the reproduction of these communities is quite complicated. They are more female communities as well. So that would be one set of questions, and another set of questions would be around the actual dedication itself, which is what is being outlawed in the immediate post-colonial period. What level, so at what age is this dedication happening? What is the agency of the women who are being dedicated? Who is saving who in these anti-Devdasi legislation? So I'll leave that set of questions for you to answer at a later stage. And we'll move to our discussant, Dr. Keshavamurthy. Kiran?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Shumatadi. One second. Yeah, I'm just trying to. 1 second. Yeah, is it on now? Yeah, I think it's on now. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you all. Thank you all for that, for a very interesting array of papers that talk to each other in very interesting ways. But I also do see some gaps between the papers. I also feel like the papers could have also spoken in other ways. I do see certain discontinuities in individual papers as well as between papers. So I will just spell them out now. So I'll just go in the same order, and I hope I can address you all by your first name, if that is all right. So yeah, so maybe I will just start with you, Sugata, since you went first, and maybe I'll just address my comments to each and every one of you, and then maybe you can start in whichever order you would like, or maybe in the same order. So let me just start with Sugata's paper. So I mean, one question that kept coming to me as I was reading your paper is that you know, I get this. I had this image in my mind as I was reading a paper of you know, the crowd or the mass as something that seems to be chaotic or seems to be impulsive or seems to be just driven blindly by nationalist aspirations, and you know, the violence that ensues as a result of this nationalist you know, frenzy or passion or whatever you want to call it. I would like to kind of question that a bit. You know, like, I'm just wondering, because if you're going to do a cross section of a riot, then you know, I would also suggest that we look at what preceded the riot and what followed it, you know, and not just look at that particular moment of violence or as this kind of a sudden outburst which is absolutely unplanned. And you know, so I'm more interested in how these riots were being orchestrated. I mean, was there a certain pattern to these riots, especially, you know, because I was also thinking of you know, Hindu-Muslim riots, and you know, Paul Brass's book on, you know, the patterns of Hindu-Muslim riots and how. So I mean, which is why it's important to kind of think. I mean, I would actually kind of ask you if you have some kind of a template in mind, you know, or some kind of a template of how, why. I mean, what patterns of violence are taking place and what kinds of negotiations are happening, and also you know, why does nationalism or nationalist aspirations or whatever you want to call it, nationalist passion, why does it have to be exclusive? You know, why does it have to be this one? Because I get the sense that nationalism seems to be over-determining your argument quite a bit, you know. So I'm just wondering if you could kind of maybe tone that down a bit, you know, and probably look at nationalism and in conjunction with other interests. You know, like, I mean, for example, a certain economic rationality, for example. You know, is there a certain economic rationale that drives these riots? Are there caste loyalties that determine what shape a riot takes? So it doesn't necessarily or immediately have to, or only have to be, you know, geographical boundaries and you know, political boundaries, and you know, it's not. I don't think it works like that entirely. I mean, there has to be some. There has to be certain other economic loyalties or caste loyalties that override, or if not override, at least crisscross or undermine or mitigate communal divides, right? So I was just I'd like to kind of push you in that direction. Then again, how would you? I mean, as I asked you earlier, how would you relate these riots to the question of gender as well as caste, right? I mean, because it also seems to be just masses, but how are these masses being gendered? How are they casted? You know, so that's something that I'd like to ask. Then to turn to recasting the caste question to Mohimarnab and Chandrasekhar. Again, I have a set of different kinds of questions. So I'm actually thinking about what I mean. How does your paper reflect on the nature of the CPM itself, of the CPI itself, in you know, in terms of the contradictions not just of caste and class, but also the contradictions within the party in terms of class hierarchies. You know, because the fact that not all communists are equally privileged. Some communists have access to you know, the privileges of education. the privileges of social capital. Not everyone does, right? And so being a part of the party may not necessarily make a difference in terms of getting access to those privileges, right? So I mean, and we have also seen lots of texts, literary texts, other kinds of political texts that satirize exactly this kind of contradiction within the party itself, right? So it's not just a question of not paying sufficient attention to caste, but also the contradictions of class itself, right? Then I am also thinking in terms of, if you could just elaborate a little bit on what you mean by the left's philosophical inability to address the refugee question. So, I mean, what exactly do you mean by that? Where do you see this philosophical inability or this kind of aporia, if you like? I mean, what does it mean exactly? I'd like to know what you mean by the word philosophical. Also, again. Some other questions about, somewhere in the beginning of the paper, you had mentioned something about living history, right? And I'm actually kind of wondering how you have used living histories yourself, or whether you've used living histories in your own paper. What does it mean to use a living history? Because I certainly remember the scene that I saw from, I'm not sure if you've watched the Underground Railroad, which is based on a novel, a fantastic kind of dramatization of this Underground Railroad, which was built by African Americans, to escape to the north and stuff. But there's that one brilliant scene which reminded me of this idea of living history, which is of the protagonist, this black woman who basically tries to escape. She escapes from the cotton plantation, and then she ends up, moving to South Carolina, where she basically works, as she kind of performs. She basically performs her blackness in a museum, like in a living history museum, which kind of tries to recreate slave labor on the cotton plantation. So I mean, I was just thinking, because that scene was very, very powerful, but also very problematic. Because what does it mean to then, recreate a certain scene of slavery without repeating the same stereotypes, right? I mean, at what level do you kind of challenge, where do you draw the line? Where do you challenge stereotypes, right? Of, caste stereotypes or whatever. So I mean, where do you use living history in your own work as a method, if you want to call it a method? And how do you interrogate it? How do you question it? Then I have some other questions, which is some clarifications. Somewhere you say that the upper caste refugees took over land that belonged to lower caste people, lower caste refugees. So were these lower caste refugees, were they lower caste refugees, or who had been resettled, or had whose land had been taken away from them, or were these people who were already living there, who were lower caste, who were then being robbed of the land? So I think there's some you have to make a correction maybe in that version of the paper that you sent us. There was some problem there, and yeah, and then I also was wondering if you had interviewed people who worked in the municipal archives. Because the municipal archives are important in terms of trying to figure out this whole resettlement plan, the demography, the ownership of homes and houses, and the changing of house numbers, and basically just trying to locate a house in a particular locality, and a proof of authorship. Not authorship, sorry, ownership, and land, land deeds, house deeds, and so on and so forth. That might give us a very interesting idea of a certain official, maybe even the gaps in the official voices, official archival voices of the whole resettlement plan. Also, certain broader questions in terms of, is there any difference, let's say, between the Communist Party as a program, as a programmatic statement of communism, and the way it works at the grassroots level, right? Because you constantly keep emphasizing on the party, but then who is the party and who does the party represent, and to what extent have you managed to interview or talk to people who work at the grassroots level? Do they have differences with the program, the program, right? And how do they work differently? Are there conflicts, and so on and so forth, right? So especially in terms of intercaste relations, right, and their response to caste and casteism. Also, I also wanted to ask you whether a lot of these studies end up being very Kolkata centric, right? And so I would like to know if you can say something about other parts of West Bengal, especially since you have that statistic that there are many more Dalits who live outside Kolkata than they live inside Kolkata. So what is your idea of intercaste relations and casteism, especially in the context of partition and resettlement plans in other parts of West Bengal, right? And then I also would like to, yeah, and right. I'll just stop with that. Then I'll just go to the other papers. Okay. I just have one more question. Do these lower caste refugees also include ST and Adivasi refugees, and how was their treatment different? I mean, how were they treated differently? What was the where did they stand? Okay, my question to Rajat, questions to Rajat, which is. Again, just to echo some of Shumita these questions that she asked earlier, maybe you could just elaborate a little bit. I know for lack of time you couldn't say everything, but maybe elaborate a little bit more on these heterodox, lower caste, alternative narratives, maybe what they are. I know you mentioned them briefly, but then I'm only asking you because I would like to push you towards elaborating more on how you think the Motua kind of a form of religiosity is different. I mean, how is it different? And what kinds of political, if any, political and social resources does it have to offer? How does it inform political action, if at all it does? Right? So I'm kind of curious about that. And I also ask you because your colleague Shukona has worked on Sahajiya Vaishnavism, and since you kind of mentioned that in your paper, I was also curious to know because again to echo what Shumita asked earlier, the question of gender becomes very important here, right? Because how do you then? Because I know from whatever little I know from her work that there's a very interesting play on gender, isn't it? And sexuality, right? Sexual fluids, the circulation of sexual fluids, the inversions of the interesting kind of what should I say, this kind of a certain sense of transgenderism inhabiting the same body, kind of a certain sexual ambiguity which constantly seems to blur boundaries of male and female, masculine and feminine, because I think somewhere you need to relate the question of caste to gender, right? And how does then complicating gender and gender stereotypes also then complicate caste? Right, because caste always works on the circulation of gendered bodies, especially female bodies, right? So I mean, so I'd like to kind of ask you that. Then I also have a few references from a context that I'm more familiar with, which is the Tamil context, where you have a certain very important anti-caste Dalit thinkers who were some of the early voices of anti-caste thought in the late 19th century. One, of course, is Ayodhidas, who basically is very important because he also comes up with these very interesting alternative narratives of dominant narratives. Where he does these very interesting etymological plays with canonical texts and words and terms from Vaishnavism. Especially when he kind of inverts a lot of these avatars of Vishnu. Comes up with very alternative kind of. But so the thing is, so I'm actually kind of thinking about how, because you seem to be suggesting in your paper somewhere that you're not satisfied, or maybe you think that these anti-caste leaders aren't satisfied with just these mere inversions, these inversions or these appropriations. But I'd like to actually ask you, why should they be any less subversive? Simply because they're appropriations or because they're inversions? It doesn't necessarily, very often it becomes more subversive precisely because you're inverting or you're trying to kind of parody or satirize something which should be canonical, should be sacrosanct, So I'm kind of and also in that case, how do these inversions and appropriations interact, negotiate with, let's say, other narratives that are not necessarily appropriating from the center? From dominant narratives. I mean, you might have other, which is why I'm again asking you if you can elaborate more on the heterodoxy where do you have other narratives that do not seem to draw from Vaishnavism or and Shaivism? And perhaps I'm not sure about. I mean, it's interesting. Why not Shaivism also? Because Vaishnavism seems to be the one that's always being appropriated, and more related to pleasure, right? Material pleasure and worldly life than Shaivism is. And again, a follow-up question also would be that if you have seen all the modern commentators and modern commentaries on the Gita, again, there is this kind of emphasis on moderation and a moderate life, moderate living. It's kind of moving away a little bit from renunciation, right? So again, do you have, again, how is Motua religiosity different from other, let's say, even upper caste reformist projects, reformist voices that again seem to be saying that we need to have, we need to live moderately, we need to, but without abstaining, without abstaining from our responsibilities, still lead a worldly life. So again, how is the Motua rhetoric any different from any of these other either upper caste reformist projects, or maybe especially in terms of the commentaries in the Gita, but also in terms of other lower caste groups and leaders, and from what they are saying, right? So I didn't entirely get a sense of the specificity in terms of their religiosity, their rituals, their maybe secret kind of. They have a lot of. I mean, not everything is out in the open, I guess. They must have some kind of, I'm not sure, maybe some kinds of rites of passage or something which is not entirely open to everyone. I mean, it can't be that easy to just join it and then say you are, you can say Hari now and you're part of it. There must be something about it, which doesn't make it that permeable, right? And also, does Buddhism then offer a model, right? Does Buddhism offer a model? Because it does for Ayodhyadas and Ambedkar. So how does Buddhism interact? Again, the question with Christianity, right? Because it seems like Haridas also seems to appear a lot like Christ or Buddha in the kind of miracles that he performs, right? So I'm kind of interested to know if there are exchanges with Christianity also, and Christian missionaries and reform. And I think I'm pretty much done with that. All right, and then I will just turn to Shreya's paper. Shreya, I just had a few questions on your paper, which is that, again, I also feel like you need to fine-tune some of your arguments a little bit, because somewhere you say that you're trying to distinguish these Mahari women Devdasis from many of the South Indian Devdasis, but there are lots of overlaps too, right? I mean, it's not entirely true that the Maharis were had greater social capital and more, they were more empowered than the South Indian ones, because many of the South Indian Devdasis also had male patrons. They also, had access to a certain degree of social and religious capital. They had connections with the king. They were also portrayed on, sculptures and so on and so forth. So they had, they were also given land grants. So they do have a certain capital. Also, as Shumita was asking earlier, this whole matrilineal thing has to be clarified a bit, because I know that a lot of these Devdasi communities had, for example, you had sons or you had brothers, right? Now, what happened to them? Right, they couldn't become Devdasis, right? So what happens to them? So many of them, especially in the 17th and 18th century, became accompanists, right? So they became percussionists. So they played the mridangam. They performed alongside, So which is why the question of, it's not just a question of dance. It's also the question of how these Devdasis shifted to music, not just dance and performance, right? It's not just sanitized forms of Bharatanatyam or whatever it is. It's also a question of dance, right? Music and vocal music and instrumental music. So how did they, many of our great Carnatic stalwarts, women stalwarts, were at some point part of these communities, right? And of course, it's a different question that they try to shun their past. They try to not talk about it, but they had or even some of our Hindustani women singers, they came from those very families and regions, and they ended up having male patrons to whom they were not married, even well into the 20th century, right? Even because it was abolished in the Madras Presidency in 1929, but even in the 1920s and so on, or even after that, they still continued having these very unusual relationships outside marriage, right? And they also ended up having they had sons who performed with them. Right? Their daughters would sing with them. The sons would perform, maybe in mridangam or whatever it is, and they would end up with them. So what happens? How do brothers and sons complicate these gender relations? Also, in terms of property relations, the transmission of property, especially since you talk about adoptive daughters, is very interesting, because I think that also brings up the question of caste, right? Because all these Devadasis, they didn't belong to the same caste group. So how does caste also complicate your argument, right? Because what does it mean to have a daughter who's adoptive, maybe not from the same caste, from a different caste group? How does that change caste relations, right, in terms of property and transmission of property? And then yeah. And it's also interesting that you say that Brahmin girls also embrace the profession, right? So I mean, that I don't know if that's an exception to Orissa, but that's interesting. And yeah, I also want to know if any of these Devadasis turn to the stage. Did they actually turn to the stage after being outlawed? Because we have examples of Jewish women and Anglo-Indian women who became stage actors, right? So why couldn't Devdasis or erstwhile Devdasis also act? Since they could actually kind of enjoy their stigma in some way, right? Because now they actually have, I mean, being stigmatized also gives you certain liberties, right, to do certain things. So I'm wondering if they turn to the stage, and if not, why not? And also, again, how is the Mahari dance form different? Right? I mean, how is it different from anything else? And how does that, in some sense, define or shape, modern dance forms, especially when they were being modernized, when they were being sanitized? Do we still see traces of the Mahari dance form? Because I know in Bharatanatyam, you do. I mean, a lot of the Sadiratam dancers were very vigorous and very erotic. They didn't occupy as much stage space as a lot of Bharatanatyam dancers do today, but there was a certain vigor to them, and they were not very angular. Right, so since a lot of modern dance is very angular and very focused on the elbows and the ankles, and very very on the joints, but you see a lot of fluidity, right? So how does that? Do you see a similar kind of a suppression, or do you see maybe a certain lingering trace of Mehari, the dance in modern forms? And when you talk about also the circulation of new global flows, of Devdasi culture through the media. Again, you need to kind of probably ask yourself, what does Devdasi mean anymore? What does it mean to say that this is Devdasi anymore, right? Because you have such a what should I say, such a rich and complex flow of images, and there's a certain afterlife to these images and these bodily movements that can no longer be identified with what you mean by Devdasi anymore, right? And people forget. I mean, public memory is so short and so prejudiced that after a point you forget. You've suppressed everything. You have no idea of what is Devdasi and what's not. You can't. You don't know what to separate. You can't isolate it anymore, right? So maybe you need to kind of ask, what does it mean to say this, that there's a certain afterlife, through these global flows. All right. So I think I will stop with that. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. So yeah.
Thank you, Kiran. And Dr. Keshavamurthy has given all the speakers number of questions, and we already have questions coming in the chat and people wanting to ask questions. So my suggestion is that we take, because we are also running quite late. So my suggestion is that we take all the questions. You add to Kiran's questions, and then the paper presenters can answer all in one go. Do you agree with that, Rohit, Kiran?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, sounds good.
Okay, great. So then what I'll do is I will add my one question to Mohimarnab and Chandrasekhar, and then hand over to Dr. Keshavamurthy to handle the question answer session. So my question to you would be, following what Dr. Keshavamurthy has already asked, which is that when I take you talk about the CPI at one time, and then the left rule in Bengal part is obviously focused on the CPM, which is perfectly understandable. But I would want a little more on how it changes. On what is the difference between CPI at an earlier point in time and then the creation of CPM, and whether that has any inflection at all in terms of caste, first. And secondly, when we are saying left, even in the post-77 period, is this an undifferentiated category? Are we equating the left wholly with the CPM, and is that fair? Is there is there caste at all in a broader left imaginary? Is there any space for that? And whether, even if we look outside the CPM for that, I ask this because there is so much actually on CPI ML traditions that have worked with Adivasi identities, for instance, very effectively. So is there at all a story, even a marginal, small, little story about caste in the left? Non-CPM left, perhaps? Kiran, over to you.
Yes, so maybe Sugata can start. If you would like to just address our questions, then maybe you can. Yeah. Sugata? Yeah. I think you have to unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself. You're still mute. You're still mute. All right. So maybe we can give you some time, Sugata, until you get the mic fixed. We can come back to you after a while. Yes. Okay. So maybe Mohimarnab and Chandrasekhar, would you like to address our questions?
Thanks, Professor Keshavamurthy, for the comments. I think it'll help us fine-tune our paper and go back to the drawing board and fix some issues in the paper. I think what you said about the hierarchies within the Communist Party and the different sort of socio-cultural capital of the different party members across the hierarchies is an extremely sort of crucial sort of observation which we need to take into account. But not to defend this, but just to sort of clarify the initial attempt which we made in this paper was to probably look at only the Bhadralok communists in the CPIM, and this is sort of tied to the question which Professor Samita Sen also asked us about the the spectrum of the broader spectrum of the left, and how do we sort of locate the CPIM in that sort of spectrum. So I think a little bit of fine tuning in terms of referring to the CPIM is probably required across our paper, because in our head and also while writing the paper, we were kind of talking about the CPIM's specific electoral role in kind of avoiding the caste question, and also probably privileging a class analysis in the socio-political articulation that it did during this period. So that is something that criticism is well taken, and we would like to probably sort of address it and fine tune it, and so that our paper does not seem like we are making a broad sort of generalization of the left regime. And probably we could probably fine tune it and just mention in more places throughout the paper that we are specifically talking about the CPIM, and not even the other sort of members in the left regime, which are the Forward Bloc or the RSP or the CPI or the other parties who kind of formed important sort of coalition members of that sort of regime. So and the point that the CPIM kind of dominated that sort of configuration in terms of votes, and also in terms of calling the shots to a large extent after coming to power in 77 and from there on till 2011, is also something which probably warrants a little bit of attention on our part, so that we can just probably sort of address that in our paper. In terms of the philosophical inability of the left in addressing the refugee category, Professor Keshavamurthy, we were primarily trying to include Joydeep Dotto's sort of observation in our understanding of the left and the refugee question, where his work is basically a Heideggerian sort of reading of the camp as a site, where he talks about the specter of partition and how he basically uses these spaces as specific ethnographic sites to understand the differential experiences of the refugees. So in terms of the philosophical inability to deal with the refugee question, what we sort of attempted to sort of argue, which probably didn't quite come across, or it did at some point, but we would probably like to sort of address it in a more detailed manner. What we attempted to say is that the refugee category, I mean, the refugee question or the identity of the refugee is such a fractured one, which we sort of delineated in other parts of the paper, that the monolithic identity which is sort of rendered to this identity is something which we are dead against, and we are trying to sort of puncture that using earlier works around that sort of line, is the kind of tendency to look at the refugees as a category. And once you sort of start dealing with the plethora of identities which kind of cut across the vectors of caste, gender, regional differences, and all these sort of plethora of multiplicities which kind of inform the refugee identities, it's very difficult if you start addressing that as a social as a category in itself. So we kind of wanted to draw from that and understand that the colony refugees and the camp refugees was the sort of distinction we tried to sort of establish, where we spoke about Bijoygad and other upper caste colonies, and this is connected to the land grab question which Professor Keshavamurthy also raised. I think what we tried to sort of delineate was also the squatters colonies coming up, and also the Jabardakhl movement of the forceful acquisition of land, which was also of the fallow lands in certain areas, and not only the lands which are owned by lower caste refugees. Because if we see the trends and the patterns of migration, the lower caste refugees did not, the Dalit refugees did not quite have the resources to directly migrate right after the partition, because they, took some time. I mean, of course, there were cases of migration, but mostly it was about the Jan, sort of Dhan and Samman sort of configuration of the upper caste refugees who had the resources to kind of connect with the relatives of the other people living across across this part of the world, and then coming, into this part of the world, and probably, and then is the question of the self-settled refugee, the romanticization of that category being the major leitmotif for post-partition discourses is something which comes in. So that is what we were trying to do. But if it did come across at any point of the paper that we were trying to only point out that the upper caste refugees just randomly came and occupied lands owned by the lower caste refugees, that was not our sort of contention at all. But at any point in the paper which we have circulated, if it did come across, we're definitely going to fine tune it. But regarding Professor Keshavamurthy's comment on municipal archives, I thank you, sir, for this sort of observation. And now that we are looking at the final paper submission in a couple of months or so, we definitely would like to go and probably contact people and do that sort of an archival research to sort of bolster that argument of our paper. How do we use living histories? Of course, I mean, mostly in terms of the embodiment of historical experiences and the performativity of historical experiences through the oral narrations of the people we have kind of interviewed, and also Kanti Biswas's autobiography, which was Amar Jibon Kichu Kotha, My Life Few Words, who was an important sort of party insider sort of a voice, because we wanted to look at how the party insider looks at the Bhadralok leadership of the CPIM kind of erasure of the caste question. So we were trying to essentially use the concept of living history to understand the differential experiences which are kind of erased in the hegemonic sort of post-partition literatures, and also the public discourses which are kind of dominated by a certain kind of Bhadralok and Brahminical tendency of whitewashing anti-caste sort of discourses and voices. I saw a couple of one question on the chat box, which was about subaltern Hindutva. Chand, would you mind taking it, or you want me to probably address it?
No. I mean, either of you can address it.
Yeah, I can take that. As far as the question of subaltern Hindutva is there, it is a complex question. It is a nuanced question, and it also requires a lot more research than that has been done now. It is, in fact, a fertile ground for research. That is something we did not go into consciously. The domain of our paper was constricted to 20th century Bengal, especially 77 to 2000. And I think that understanding subaltern Hindutva, if it is there, if it is not there, at what level it is there, who is behind it, what are the forces behind it, what are the institutional forces underpinning this process, if this process is there in the way people are conceptualizing it, all of this requires a lot more research, a lot more data. In fact, we have to look at a lot of post-election data. I mean, the election has just happened. A lot more research also has to happen on that front. So in that sense, I am definitely not qualified to answer about subaltern Hindutva at the very outset. Rohit Datta Roy has asked a question on, he has in fact suggested addition of police reports, corporate housing registrations, preference in party memberships. Thank you so much. This is a very good point that we will definitely make in our study. And also when we are talking about, yeah. So that was that. And also I would like to also answer Samita ma'am's question. When she said, are you looking at left as an undifferentiated category? And is there a space for caste in that? And I think that while Meg has already answered this question on CPI, CPIM, and the thing and how we have to make it clear, I would also like to answer this by saying that this has been a personal dilemma for me also, that what is the left? I mean, that question has come up a lot in recent times because of the anti-caste discourses, where there is a lot of question on the social location of those leading the left movement. And then there is another school of thought which disputes that by saying that no, there is a huge left universe. So within that, it is something that I've grappled with, but as I have shown even in the course of my paper, it is not, the left did not function in a homogeneous, monolithic way in throughout the country. In fact, as we pointed out, in fact Professor Ramya Bakshi points out, if we compare Tripura and Bengal, the Adivasis progressed much more literacy-wise. In fact, women progressed much more. Women from marginalized sections, they attained literacy, which was not seen in Bengal. And Kanti Biswas, when he talks about how he uses the examples of communists from Kerala to say, talk about caste. So we are seeing that it's not that left, upper caste, bad. It is a complex question. It is something which differs if you look at it regionally. And I definitely personally feel that the caste question is definitely something that many left movements have sought to address. And we are seeing that even now, because there are a lot of groups that assert and say that they're Ambedkarite Marxists, for instance. And it might be a contradiction, but we are also seeing efforts to to resolve that contradiction and evolve a new politics of caste and class coming together. So that is a fascinating question. It is something that I have thought of a lot. And it is something that I'm still coming to terms with as we see more and more political currents and how it is turning out in our country. So that would be that. Yeah, Meg, anything else that you would like to add?
Just to probably just have a concluding comment on the question on subaltern Hindutva. So it's interesting to see just before the elections happened in West Bengal, there was this campaign called No Vote to BJP, where you see a lot of Bhadralok actors going in front of Kali temples and saying that we will not allow NRC to happen, we will stay in this country, and holding prasads and in front of Kali temples, and probably sort of explaining their unflinching sort of commitment to Hinduism in general. But this sudden sort of question about subaltern Hindutva, and if the lower caste votes are going to sort of migrate to the BJP and are going to desert the other political parties, it's very important to see that the No Vote to BJP campaign, which I specifically believe is a sort of liberal Bhadralok machination. It's important to see that the campaign at no point engages with the question of who in fact sets the agenda for Hindutva in this country. It's the upper caste Hindus. Ambedkarites, or we were speaking to Professor Shubhajit Moshkar at one point of time, and he was also saying that the Dalits of this country do not probably have, who probably want to voice an autonomous, assertive sort of articulation, or probably want to talk about a certain Ambedkarite politics. They are kind of sandwiched between political parties which are all run by upper caste people. So it's not that only the CPIM is Brahminical, or the TMC is not, or the BJP is not. All of the political parties are equally, if not comparatively more or less sort of Brahminical. So it's important when we ask the question of subaltern Hindutva, we understand that it's the upper caste Hindus who are kind of setting the agenda. So for example, someone like Dilip Ghosh does not set the agenda for elections in West Bengal. It belongs to the OBC community. It's the people like Mohan Bhagwat, it's the people like Swapan Das Gupta, it's the people, the upper caste Hindus who kind of set the agenda for the election to kind of run on mediatized sort of environments in this world. So yeah, just a comment on that.
Okay, so can I just request Shreya to respond to her questions?
All right, thank
and then
you.
we can come to Rajat. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much. So first of all, thank you for the very helpful comments to both of you, Professor Sen and Keshavamurthy. I'll start with Professor Sen's point of matriarchy, because I think that's an important point, and I didn't get time, or I would have elaborated more on why I chose to classify this community as a matriarchal one. So I am aware that matriarchy is applied as a kinship concept, more specifically to tribal communities and Adivasis in India in terms of their quotidian cultures. There are a number of reasons, however, that I decided to classify the Mahari community as a matriarchal one, and I'll state them. I think the first one is their set of adoption practices and how the continuation of the lineage. And I think Frederick Apple Martland does the most extensive study of this, when she studies that there was a conscious disadvantaging of male offspring as compared to female offspring. And this was particularly prominent in the pre-colonial period and in the immediate after, sort of in the years before the revolt of 1857, where sort of male offspring did not get any opportunities in the inheriting of properties, and Maharis were granted remunerations in lands from the temple's lands, and they all passed on to children, and there were to their daughters, and there was a strategic function of this to continue the lineage. And yes, and of course this crops up in a number of ways in the independent nation state in high court cases, when this goes not just contrary to Hindu laws of maintenance and succession, but also contrary to, the adoption structure under patriarchal families. And you have two such cases as this in the Orissa High Court, where sort of the daughters of Devadasis, one is Harapriya and one is Kokila Prabha, and their daughters were not allowed to inherit the property. One of them pertained to having been annexed by the state, and one of them had to do more along lines of Harapriya's daughter not being married and sort of assumed to be exercising immoral relations. So this immorality paradigm, and it can be tied back to the juxtaposition with sort of the status daughters had historically when it came to inheriting lands, inheriting properties, and the economic basis of it. The second, I would say, is one thing, however, that complicates the matriarchal narrative is the issue of minor dedication. And this is the issue of minors is what creates predominantly the problem in humanitarian discourses, particularly the League of Nations, which cracks down on trafficking in the 1900s. And here it is important to mention that girls were dedicated as minors. So if you are a Mahari Devadasi, adoption occurred in a variety of forms. They could be biological children, daughters, or they could be daughters adopted from relatives, or they could be daughters who were abandoned and, dedicated to the Jagannath temple. And because they were dedicated as minors, and yes, I do understand this is a circumcised nature of sexual autonomy, because relationships with the king, the Gajapati king, and some sort of pandas of the priestly community were almost mandated. So it wasn't absolute agency, but of a circumscribed nature. And this is why the dedication at minors complicates the narrative of trafficking and exploitation. But one point I do want to elaborate and emphasize on is that even though the minor aspect complicates the matriarchal narrative as well, even though sort of Devadasis are protected, reformed, and rehabilitated by the state, if you interview most Devadasi women from the Orissa context or even the South India context, and Lucinda Ramberg has done a compelling study of this, they resent the alternatives that state rehabilitation and protection offers them in terms of putting them strictly into domesticated roles, envisioning them to fit directly into roles as domesticated wives and mothers, whereas they previously exercised economic autonomy. So this domestication in terms of rehabilitation, and this is very much even part of partition rehabilitation projects, is something very much that Devadasis do resent, and this is articulated in oral histories. So yes, while I am aware of the challenges and issues of romanticizing this community, what I think something that adds credence to the argument is the alternatives women were offered in the aftermath of reform and rehabilitation projects, and how they further, instead of empowering women, propelled a turn towards commercial sex work or further marginalized them. And it was almost a vicious cyclical term. In this context, I do want to get to Professor Keshavamurthy's points about sons in the family and their roles, because I think this is important, especially the topic of what you brought about in terms of music, because I did read a paper by Davesh Soneji on, it wasn't just dance, but Carnatic music, where sort of Kirtan and the tradition and the sons of the family that played in the southern tradition. What happened in the context of Orissa Devadasis is Pankaj, a lot of sort of the sons or relatives of Maharis went on to play a role in the revivalist tradition of Odissi. So if you look at Pankaj Charan Das, who's colloquially known as the father of Odissi, he's the daughter of a Mahari. And sort of it is his personal background and lineage that sort of leads him to take up the revival tradition in an almost very active form. And I would also say that in terms of the music parallel, however, I am yet to draw strong connections, as in the case with Carnatic music, because a lot of I think a lot of Mahari's roles were limited to dance. Instead of, there were Bhitar Gaunis who sang the Gita Govinda, which was the religious epic, but I need to dig a little deeper on what it meant in terms of performativity to the stage of music beyond just dance. So thank you very much for pointing it out. In terms of Devadasis turning to the stage on this topic, I actually have interviewed Ileana Sitaristi, who's a very prominent Odissi dancer today and sort of recipient of the Padma Shri for her contributions to Odissi. And she's a student of Kelucharan Mahapatra. And she articulates in this aspect of revival very strongly in the sanitization of some of the erotic elements of Odissi dance. I'm personally not an Odissi dancer. In fact, I grew up in boarding school learning Bharatnatyam, and I personally in performative gestures can draw strong parallels and the difference between Sadir and Bharatnatyam, where Sadir was very much sanitized from the erotic elements of, you know, the Devadasi form. In the case of Odissi, I would say there was the inputs from Ileana Sitaristi sort of suggest to me how there was a conscious sort of de-eroticization and sanitization of Odissi, especially aspects of what was called Batu, which is the posture, and the Abhinaya mudras. And this was, but yes, I think I would have a better perspective if I was an Odissi dancer myself to, you know, position myself and actually draw those parallels. But I do feel that strong parallels can be drawn between the Sadi tradition and the revival by Rukmini Devi Arundel, which was done very much along bourgeois respectable sensibilities to be taught to an upper caste or a middle class audience. Another point I want to make is the Annapurna Theatre in sort of Puri, which emerged as a major site for the making of culture as well as regional identity in Orissa. And it is important to mention this because some Devadasis like Shashimani, and this was actually recounted to me by Shashimani, tried to take up public roles on the Annapurna Theatre, but also because of the conservative nexus, I think, of values in Orissa, in which the Jagannath temple is almost assumes a sacral nature, and this almost got compounded with the sex scandal that followed the Devadasi abolition. So there was almost a conscious systemic institutional effort to distance these women from public stages like the Annapurna Theatre, where Shashimani was not allowed to take up jobs or give public performances. There is one place where Ileana Sitaristi had taken Shashimani to actually Calcutta to do a public performance, and she recounts that basically Shashimani came to life when she was on stage, and you saw a completely radically different version. And it was almost unfortunate that in the revival of Odissi, or you know, in the cultural sort of almost revival that took place in Orissa after it sort of was accompanied by a strong literary and regional nationalist movement, Maharis were not part of this discourse, and there was a constant exclusion and stigmatization almost. It is also, I think, important to mention that the administration of the temple passed from the Puri Gajapati family to the state government in 1956, and the takeover of the administrative structure also played a key role in terms of the state government determining the salaries, the allowances, and remunerations from the 1960s onwards. And you see a conscious, if you look at the census records, you see a constant rate of decline, and they stopped even getting the Mahaprasad Bhogo in the 2000s. So that parallels can also be drawn with the administration handled by the Gajapati family, as then passing on to the secular structures of the state government. And yes, finally, I will end on the question that Professor Keshavamurthy asked in terms of what does the term Devadasi mean anymore. And I think this gained meaning with the extinction of the community in 2015. And I think this is something that gave the Orissa context a slightly different regional and particular nature in terms of the Devadasi system, because while you still see statistics of Devadasi dedication in the hundreds and Devadasi communities in the hundreds actually across parts of Maharashtra and South India, there's also the caste phenomenon in terms of trafficking and all of those particulars. In Orissa, when this community became extinct and died, there was almost like a romanticization and a fetishization of this community. And yes, the narrative also transformed a slight bit, because there was almost a silence on aspects of their sexual economy, and there was almost a renewed attempt to portray them along a celibate nun narrative, or a narrative of romanticization that the community had died. And it's also important to mention here that the Jagannath temple, in fact, petitioned to the Odisha High Court to revive the practice, and they had 5 applicants. But owing to national laws, the secular paradigm, human rights, it very much now, the system on a nationwide basis was conceptualized and postularized along a prostitution narrative. So I think even though it did start with a regional specificity in a regional register, it did sort of situate itself along these national perceptions of prostitution, and that again underwent a disruption upon the extinction of this community. So what I do hope to also do and articulate in the thesis is these disruptors and these discontinuities in popular culture and sort of collective memory in the context of Orissa. Thank you. I hope I answered all the questions.
Thank you, Shreya. Thank you very much. Rajat, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Hussain, and thank you, Professor Keshavamurthy, for your kind questions and observations on the paper. It's actually kind of, but can I also, okay, I had 2 observations about the other paper. Can I just make them, I mean, it's not a question, rather it's rather like an observation or a kind of comment to Chandrasekhar and Mohimarnab. Just two points. I was wondering, not that you have to answer, but I was just thinking, because it's something, I mean, like, we all are actually, in a way, I like the way you have put it forward. I was thinking, like, few aspects, like, why is it, despite all this, why is it that the left parties have gotten the maximum support from lower caste throughout? So this is something I mean, like, I just want to complicate what you just talked about. It's not something like I mean, like, Oyun Guha's work has actually, I mean, I like the way you put the criticism, but I mean, there's a work which also shows that the whole land reform actually did advantage the lower caste, okay, and in a massive manner. So which actually ended up creating a lot of support. So even if, and that brings me to the second aspect, that the whole point which I think Chandrasekhar was mentioning, but somehow gone missing, is a little on this question of this sociability of called party society. Just if you can think a little more on that, like, party society resolves all the paradoxes, and in the city like Calcutta, we have these 2 big theories. How do we kind of, when you are trying to put this forward as a kind of left and the caste question, how do you tackle this question on party society, which is so prevalent in my own field work? I've seen in the village level Panchayati Raj institution, party and panchayat are the same. Doipan Bhattacharya's whole work, and then in cities like Calcutta, we have Partho Chatterjee's work on political society, which is almost like, same, like, different version of the same theory. So just to think about this a little more, and I just had two of these observations, and I'll come back to my paper actually, and I think it's very interesting. Well, Professor Sen, you're the historian here. I am someone who has read mostly secondary literature, and and I would definitely go back and basically and study Keshav Chandra Sen. I was reading Keshav Chandra Sen from Kenneth Jones' work. There are 2 types of narratives I found. One is John Stevens' work, which is the Forgotten Prophet. I think there's a book on Keshav Chandra Sen, and the other one is, which has a very different story to tell than Kenneth Jones' that New Cambridge History work, which where he talks about how the relation between Vijay Krishna Goswami and Keshav Chandra Sen, the rifts which actually causes. I mean, I'm not someone who has primary hold on, like, who has hold on this archival material on this, but what I gather from these books is that the story tells us that the whole prophetic kind of claim, avatarism, the whole claim which Keshav Chandra Sen made, also the claim about he is the survivor of Hinduism, I quote it. These are something which actually kind of, and also the whole Brahmoism, the whole philosophy of Brahmoism, which in the earlier life Keshav Chandra actually kind of kept alive or kind of propagated, is something which made me kind of, and that is the impression which Kenneth Jones's work created in front of me. So I was not thinking of the Christian Keshav Chandra Sen, but the one before 1866, especially the debate which is happening between, let's say, Vijay Krishna Goswami as a kind of a person coming and following as the leader, like Keshav Chandra Sen. So that was something which I was having an idea about. And primarily, I was thinking also about Bankim's work and work on Hinduism, work on Aryans, work on caste in Lower Bengal. So these are the works, these are the essays. What is the my primary question, as I already put it, is what is the episteme for this knowledge? What is the hermeneutic tradition which they kind of they kind of they base their work on? And there is no doubt the work of Brian Hatcher also kind of, I think, pointed this out, that even in the case of Vidyasagar, that they did not want to get themselves alienated from the kind of Bhadralok mass. So that's the primary reason. They didn't want to be perceived as someone who is Nastika, someone who does not believe in God. So that tradition of thinking is something which I was trying to point at as a kind of my kind of departure. And vis-a-vis that, something we come into to Professor Keshavamurthy's question, is this element about Vaishnavism, heterodox traditions, and also definitely Buddhism. So, if I can, you had many observations, but if I can kind of put them in together in one point, which is like although there are many other small sections, I'll just keep it precise and just try to answer on the question of subversion. See, as the part of the paper, primary paper is like called as Postcolonial Theory and its Outcasts. So I think what I have studied, like kind of my readings on Bengal's minor sects, primarily are coming from, let's say, the work of Tanika Sarkar, the work of on this minor sect called Balak Dasa, and Chaitanya Bhakti. So this is one sect, and then Partho Chatterjee has a text as a piece on reading of Bolohari Sampradaya, Bolohari community. So and also, of course, there are many more. I'm just thinking of these two right now. But my point is that in all these readings, I think I find a problem in this reading, simply because what it seems like to me is that this whole, like the contemporary Dalit authors, and simultaneously if we look at this early 20th century text written by these lower caste, anti-caste thinkers, is that these texts are not merely subversive texts. So the whole politics of subversion, where the boundary is getting blurred, as like the way Buddhism has been studied in most of the cases. I'm not making any big claim, but this is something which I have serious kind of a little problem with. Is that what we miss out in this whole project is that spirituality keeps on coming. Spirituality, the domain of immaterial, the domain of asceticism, whereas if I just think about Matua question, their primary focus, primary emphasis is on materiality, the work, the whole element of not asceticism. The reason why Matua was created is because, as we see in the hagiography of on Harijat Thakur, is that they wanted to get rid of Vaishnavism, the ascetic tradition of Vaishnavism, where people will just follow, do devotional work all day and not work. Okay, so the whole karma here becomes the work tradition. So they would be not focusing on too much on devotional element of practicing religion. Rather, to them, question of material, that is work. The question of simultaneously, the question of thinking outside Brahmanical tradition, because they have noticed, and this is my reading tells me from this text, that they have noticed that whenever we're trying to move into any form of devotion, we ended up reaching back to Gita, and these authors are talking about, we end up reaching back to Gita or Vedantic tradition of thinking. So somehow they want to completely alienate themselves from even Sahajiya Vaishnavism. So and this is where they stand, I think, different than, let's say, the Balak Dasha tradition of Tanika Sarkar's work. This is something which I've developed in this recent work, which is forthcoming, and where this question of this post-colonial theories, reading of sect like, let's say, Bolohari, where Partho Chatterjee tries to talk about that Bolohari community is looking for emancipation within its own body, like the kind of point, I think, which you are trying to hint at, is that they're trying to find emancipation, that if I am pure from inside, nothing external can pollute, right? So this kind of argument. What I want to argue is that my reading of Matua tells me completely different. I think it's this reading is like so we have what we have at the end of the day, two types of readings. On the one hand, you have this inner outer paradigm which is like completely nicely, which is flexible in terms of moving from one domain to another domain. With regard to this lower caste bodies, we are looking at purity from inside, and socially that person is completely segregated. And that is the offshore, that is the outcome we get from this form of subversive theorization, which I'm completely kind of, and that brings me to my last point. I'm sorry for exceeding time. Is that contemporary politics, contemporary Matua politics, and especially now on the question of their association, some of their association with Hindutva organization, and some of their association with kind of anti-caste association. This rifts, this fragmented form of Matua expression, political expression in present time, and this is something which I've I've done a field work or with ethnographic work with the contemporary Matua organizations, and what I see among them is that this reading of this tradition, reading of this text, and their political outcome actually kind of is reflective of this, the way these people read the texts. Okay, and their political positions are also kind of reflective of that. And so this hermeneutic tradition is what I'm trying to focus on, and what I'm trying to argue, that the way these people, let's say one section has followed the text and then read Ambedkar and kind of appropriated them in a certain manner, has created a different type of politics in today's time vis-a-vis another sect within the same community, let's say Matua community, and they are having a different kind of political expression. So subaltern Hindutva may be kind of seen as a kind of, as a very different kind of trajectory of Matua vis-a-vis the other one. We are thinking as like someone who is talking about the inconsistency within the text. I hope that answers kind of comments.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Would you like to address the question in the chat box, Rajat?
No, I think I addressed that with.
You did? The one on good. No, okay, fine. All right. Thank you.
To free themselves from the stranglehold of the upper caste regime.
Yes.
I think it's something. The simple answer is yes and no. The whole question is, how do you look at it? Like, so the Matuas, anti-caste writers who are
Rajat, I think
American hegemony completely writing against anti-caste, who are writing against anti-caste, they want to kind of assert that they are.
Sorry, we lost you in the middle.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, my point is like there are some vehement Ambedkarite anti-caste thinkers, Matuas, who are strongly against any form of kind of upper caste hegemony, and then there are some who are also kind of operating with it. So I think it's something which is not. I mean, it's not to say yet that they have able to overcome upper caste hegemony altogether, and but yet there is resistance. This is the point I want, and that is what whole Dalit literature all about. Even in the time of left, Dalit literature, it's been 30 years now, more than 30 years, Dalit literature somewhere, it flourished out of nowhere. And I think it has to do with this tradition of anti-caste thinking, not subversion. And that is what I'm very strongly kind of convinced of. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Sugata, would you like to just address the questions?
Yes, and you can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to be as brief as possible because it's fairly late. And so your first question was what preceded the riot and what followed it. Rather than just taking a very, snapshot sort of a view where the crowd or the mass seems chaotic and driven by frenzy. Now, I just immediately, as you asked the question, I was reminded of two works. One is by John O. Mukherjee. It's called Hungry Bengal. And there's another one by Sri Manjuri. It's called Through War and Famine. And they talk about what happened, largely the famine and the war are two experiences, and the formation of the Bengal Muslim League ministry. These are three things which have a watershed impact on Bengal politics. And there's a congealing of identities as we gravitate towards the time of independence. And 1946 riot is, I believe, one of the fallouts of the congealing of all these identities. Like you talked about, you asked me another question of what about the question of gender, caste, of the rioting mass? And and what happens to caste during this point? It's very interesting that something that we all know from our readings of literature on the history of riots in colonial India, that riots are times which produces these are moments of vertical unification in society, where a man from an upper class man can fight shoulder to shoulder with a man from the lower caste. And this we see happening during the time of the riot of 1946. I mean, otherwise, a conflagration of that scale, I mean, which left more than 5,000 people dead in less than 4 days by a very conservative estimate, is very difficult to imagine, in the sense that if there were fragments, or rather, if there were segments within the writing crowd, in the sense that there were segments of, say, upper caste Hindus and lower caste Hindus who were fighting Muslims. And again, I I shouldn't use the term Muslims as a flattening out term. There are many segments within Bengal Muslims, and Calcutta is a melting pot of Muslim cultures, in the sense there's not one Muslim culture, that's several Muslim cultures. But 1946, August 1946 down to September 1947 is a time when these identities are kind of subsumed under this frenzy of, and what I call nationhood. There's not much of nationalism in this in these riots. It's nationhood in the sense that there's an element of solidarity which one makes these rioters believe that they are a part of a nation. I mean, when I interviewed Gopal Mukherjee, that was many years back in '99, and he was already 80 plus, and he kept on referring to the nation during his interview. And this is a man who barely received any education, who was marginalized from the late 50s, and he was at best remembered as a local bully from the 1960s. And then he lost influence when the left came to power. He lost whatever little influence he had within his locality. But he's a man who imagines himself as part of a nation. And I must also add at this point that an influential work which led me into thinking about this paper is Sumit Sarkar's essay in Subaltern Studies, Volume 3, which is Conditions and Nature of Subaltern Militancy. Now, the unfortunate thing is, Professor Sarkar had a welter of information which could guide him into the mental world, or the collective mind mentality of the subalterns, which I do not have as yet. I don't have that. And so I had to depend on against the grain reading of the archive that we find in as in the national and state archives, as well as the newspapers and the oral sources that I could get. And then you asked a question about how were these riots orchestrated. The answer is yes and no. The best work in this respect, I would say, would be it's a brief essay by Nariaki Nakazato, and he says that, and very correctly, that the riots, when it started, they were orchestrated, in the sense that people were led to take up violence, and there was a fair visible element of leadership from high politicians when the riot started. But within hours of outbreak of the riot on the 16th of August, the orchestration kind of breaks up and it melts away, and crowd violence takes place, in the sense that Nariaki Nakazato, he cites an example of a point in time during the Great Calcutta Killing, as it's called, when Sarawadi, along with Kiran Shankar Rai, was touring Calcutta in a jeep along with some policemen. They were trying to stop rioters, and at one place, Muslim rioters started. They tried to assault Sarawati, so he fled from the place immediately. So the riots were orchestrated. Then I'm answering as briefly as possible, so these might not be very conclusive answers. Then you asked another very important question about the template, the patterns of violence. For example, what we see on studies on riots done by Paul Brass. Now, Paul Brass has a brief study on partition riot violence, where he says that much of the violence that was taking place was retributive in character, which is true. But I kind of unpacked the retributive bit of the patterns of violence which I could observe, and what I could come to, what I could arrive at, was that once you go through these the descriptions of violence that we get, which are either termed criminal or communal, or for that matter, as Paul Brass interprets it, as retributive, we might get to a point where these patterns of violence can be seen through the lens of solidarities which are created by means of violence, and which again are informed by a sense of nationhood. And that's what I tried to do in this paper. That's what I tried to work. That's what this paper is on. Okay, so I come to the next question, and you asked whether there was an economic rationale, whether there were caste loyalties in operation, or was it just nationalism? Now, this is a question which is very difficult to answer. Economic rationale, if going by Jono Mukherjee's work, positively existed, and Sri Manjari's work positively existed, especially given the experience of the famine. The famine was so badly mishandled by the Muslim League government. The insensitivity which Sarawati, as the civil supplies minister, and Nazimuddin displayed during this time positively fed into the fury that we see on part of especially lower class Hindus in the riot. Whether caste loyalties, well, I can on the basis of the primary sources that I've gone through, caste loyalties did play a role, and along with class loyalties, I would possibly add linguistic loyalties and loyalties of I would possibly also add linguistic and spatial loyalties, in the sense that I can cite an example of a slum inhabited by Bihari laborers attacking Muslims and trying to defend themselves from their violence. Now, there you see an operation of caste loyalties and spatial loyalties, as in people who come from one place in or one district or a set of districts from Bihar have gathered in this city, who work as laborers in a slum, and there these loyalties are very strong, and they kind of feed into their cohesion as a rioting crowd. And finally, the question of gender of the rioting mass. Unfortunately, the body of primary sources that we get on the riot of 1946 and thereafter on the riots of 1947 remain kind of sort of silent on the question of gender. There are for example, I read through newspapers of these times, and I have cited quite a number of examples from newspaper reports of people citing their lived experience of the riot, how they survived the riot, and what happened during the riot. They do not talk about women in their family. They do not talk about women in their family. Now, this might have to do with the question of honor. This is a deliberate silence. I would refuse to believe that nothing ever happened to women during the riots, and they weren't at the receiving end of the violence. And it's only in 1947 that there was one sensational case of a rape by Punjabi Muslim policemen in central Calcutta of a Hindu woman, and which Sarawati tried to play down, and it was played up by all the newspapers edited by Hindus. So the gender question is something which it's difficult to plumb in terms of information, but there's an aspect of the riot that primary sources remain silent on. So it's difficult for historians to answer this question conclusively. So I'll stop here because it's fairly late.
Thank you.
Thank you
very
for
much.
your questions. They were very, very interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Sure, thank you. I don't have any concluding remarks. I'm sorry we can't take any more questions since we're already 45 minutes past time. But unless Shumita D has any concluding remarks, then
I won't detain you with concluding remarks, but I did want to thank all the presenters for all 4 papers have been an absolute delight, and that it's been a very, very pleasant afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.